This video will help you sleep and relax. But before we begin, I would like to know which city you're from and what time you're watching this. Now, subscribe to the channel, relax, and let's begin. I've been a trail guide in Fresno, California for over a decade now. I know these mountains like the back of my hand. Every trail, every landmark, every potential danger. But nothing could have prepared me for what happened with Chuck. It was supposed to be a routine 3-day expedition to Beartooth Mountain. Chuck had hired me as his private guide. He was a physics professor at the local university, in his mid-50s, seemed fit enough for the trek. When I met him at the trailhead that morning, he seemed a bit off, jittery, distracted. I chalked it up to pre-hike nerves. As we started up the trail, Chuck kept stopping to examine rocks, trees, seemingly random spots on the ground. He'd mutter to himself, scribble in a little notebook. I tried to make conversation, but he'd just grunt one-word answers. Not the chattiest client I'd ever had, but hey, to each their own. It wasn't until we made camp that first night that things got really weird. As I was setting up the tent, I noticed Chuck wandering in circles at the edge of our campsite, holding what looked like some kind of homemade gadget. It was a metal rod with wires and lights, making a faint humming sound. "Everything okay over there, Chuck?" I called out. He startled like he'd forgotten I was there. "Oh yes, fine, he said quickly, stuffing the device in his pack. "Just, taking some readings for a project." I raised an eyebrow but didn't push it. Wasn't my business what the guy did in his free time. We ate dinner in awkward silence, then turned in for the night. I woke up sometime in the early hours to the sound of Chuck muttering outside the tent. Unzipping the flap, I saw him pacing again, that weird device in his hand. The lights on it were flickering wildly. "Chuck, you all right, man?" He whirled to face me, eyes wide and feverish in the moonlight. "It's here," he whispered. "Can't you feel it? The energy. It's incredible." Before I could respond, he took off running into the darkness. I scrambled after him, heart pounding. What the hell was going on? I found him about a quarter-mile away, standing stock still in a small clearing. His device was going haywire, lights flashing, emitting a high-pitched whine. "Chuck, what are you doing? It's the middle of the night. We need to get back to camp." He didn't seem to hear me. "All these years," he murmured. "All these years, and it was right here, hidden in plain sight." I was starting to get seriously freaked out. I approached cautiously, put a hand on his shoulder. "Come on, buddy, let's head back. We can talk about whatever this is in the morning." He shrugged me off, but allowed me to lead him back to the campsite. I didn't sleep much after that. The next day was tense. Chuck barely spoke, just kept fiddling with that device as we hiked. Every time I tried to bring up what had happened, he'd change the subject or ignore me completely. We made camp earlier than planned that evening. Chuck insisted we stop at this particular spot. Said the readings were strongest here. I was beyond questioning him at this point. Just wanted the trip to be over. As night fell, the atmosphere felt heavy, oppressive. The usual forest sounds seemed muffled, distant. Chuck was more agitated than ever, pacing, muttering, scribbling furiously in his notebook. I must have dozed off at some point, because the next thing I knew, I was jolted awake by an ear-splitting shriek. I scrambled out of the tent to find nothing. Chuck was gone. His sleeping bag was empty, still warm. His pack was there, his boots, everything, but no Chuck. "Chuck!" I yelled, my voice echoing in the eerie stillness. "Chuck!" No response. I grabbed my flashlight and started searching. That's when I saw it, a pile of clothes about 50 yards from our campsite. Chuck's clothes, all of them, neatly folded, with that strange device sitting on top, still humming faintly. My blood ran cold. What the actual fuck was happening? I spent the rest of the night searching, calling until my voice was hoarse. As soon as there was enough light, I hiked out to the nearest ranger station to report Chuck missing. The search went on for weeks. Rangers, local police, search and rescue teams, they combed every inch of that mountain. But there was no trace of Chuck, no body, no blood, no signs of animal attack or foul play. He had simply vanished. They grilled me for days, but I told them everything I knew about Chuck's strange behavior, the device, the clothes. They looked at me like I was crazy. Hell, maybe I was. Nothing about this made any sense. I've replayed those 2 days in my mind 1,000 times, trying to find some explanation, some clue I might have missed. But I always come up empty. The official report ruled it as an accidental death, presumed fallen into a ravine or crevasse that searchers couldn't access. But I know that's bullshit. I was there. I saw whatever the hell I saw. I don't guide anymore. Can't bring myself to go back into those mountains. The memory of Chuck's disappearance haunts me. The look in his eyes that last night, the conviction in his voice when he said, "It's here." What was there? What did he find? And where the hell did he go? I don't know if I'll ever have answers. But I know one thing for certain. Something happened on Beartooth Mountain that defies explanation. And it scares the living shit out of me to this day. Sometimes, on quiet nights, I swear I can still hear that faint humming sound. And I wonder, is Chuck still out there somewhere? Or did he find whatever he was looking for and simply leave this world behind? I don't know which possibility terrifies me more. The day started off perfectly. The weather was crisp and clear as we met our guide, Charles Bryden, at the trailhead. He seemed friendly and knowledgeable, pointing out interesting flora and sharing tidbits about the local wildlife as we began our ascent. Lana and I exchanged excited glances, feeling like we'd hit the jackpot with such an experienced guide. As we climbed higher, the views became more and more spectacular. The jagged peaks pierced the sky, and glacial lakes glimmered like sapphires far below. Charles led us confidently along narrow ridges and up steep inclines. Despite the physical challenge, I felt exhilarated and alive. We stopped for lunch at a scenic overlook about halfway up the mountain. As Lana and I munched on our sandwiches and trail mix, Charles stepped away to check in on his handheld radio. At first, we didn't think much of it, probably just standard procedure to touch base with the tour company. But then we heard his voice rise sharply. "What do you mean he was there? Lisa, what the hell is going on?" Charles's tone had changed completely, tight with anger and disbelief. Lana and I exchanged uncomfortable glances, trying not to eavesdrop, but unable to avoid overhearing. "How long has this been going on? I can't believe you'd do this to me." Charles was shouting now, his face contorted with rage. I felt a chill run down my spine that had nothing to do with the mountain air. This was clearly a deeply personal call, and Charles had seemingly forgotten we were even there. We sat frozen, unsure what to do. Suddenly, Charles whirled around and stormed back to where we were sitting. His eyes were wild, his breathing heavy. "Break's over. We're heading back down. Now." "But we're not even at the summit yet," Lana ventured hesitantly. Charles fixed her with such a menacing glare that she physically recoiled. "I said we're going back down. Move it." My heart was pounding as we hastily repacked our bags. What the hell had just happened? The friendly professional guide from this morning had vanished, replaced by someone unstable and frightening. As we started our descent, Following Charles's rigid back, I caught Lana's eye. Her face mirrored the fear I felt twisting in my gut. The trip down was nerve-wracking. Charles set a brutal pace, practically jogging down the steep trail. Lana and I struggled to keep up, our legs trembling with exertion and fear. Several times I nearly lost my footing on loose scree, catching myself at the last second. "Keep up," Charles barked, not even turning to look at us. "I don't have all day to babysit you two." I was shocked by his complete personality change. This man who had been so patient and encouraging on the way up now seemed to view us as burdens, even threats. My mind raced, trying to piece together what I'd overheard. Had his wife cheated on him? Was that what the call was about? I felt a twinge of sympathy, but it was overwhelmed by the very real fear of being stuck on this mountain with someone who was clearly unraveling. About an hour into our descent, Lana's foot slipped on a patch of loose gravel. She cried out as she fell hard, twisting her ankle. I rushed to help her up, but Charles just stood there, glowering. "I'm sorry," Lana whimpered, tears in her eyes. "I think I've sprained it. Can we rest for a minute?" Charles's face contorted with rage. "Are you kidding me? We don't have time for this." He stomped over and roughly yanked Lana to her feet, ignoring her gasp of pain. "Hey!" I protested, shocked by his manhandling. "Take it easy. She's hurt." Charles rounded on me, getting right in my face. His eyes were crazed, spittle flying from his mouth as he yelled, "Don't you tell me what to do. I'm in charge here, and if you can't keep up, I'll leave you both on this godforsaken mountain." I stumbled back, truly terrified now. This man was completely unhinged. We were alone in the wilderness with him, no cell service, no way to call for help. My mind raced through awful scenarios. What if he abandoned us here? Or worse, what if he decided to take out his anger on us physically? Lana was sobbing quietly as she limped along, leaning heavily on me for support. I tried to move as quickly as I could while supporting her weight, acutely aware of Charles's looming presence behind us. Every time I heard him mutter or kick a rock, I flinched. The rest of the descent was a blur of pain and fear. My legs ached, my lungs burned, but terror kept me moving. Lana's ankle had swollen to twice its normal size, and I knew she was in agony. But we didn't dare ask to stop again. When we finally stumbled into the parking lot, I've never been so relieved to see civilization. But our ordeal wasn't quite over. As we approached Charles's truck, he suddenly whirled on us. "If either of you breathes a word about what happened up there, I'll make you regret it," he snarled, jabbing a finger in our faces. "As far as anyone knows, it was a normal hike. Got it?" We nodded mutely, too terrified to do anything else. The drive back to our hotel was tense and silent. Charles's knuckles were white on the steering wheel, and he kept muttering to himself, occasionally punching the dashboard. When he finally dropped us off, Lana and I practically fell out of the truck in our haste to get away from him. Once in our room, the full impact of what we'd been through hit us. We broke down crying, holding each other, and struggling to process the nightmarish day. How had a simple hiking trip turned into such a horrifying ordeal? The next morning, still shaken, we went to the tour company's office to report what had happened. The manager was appalled and assured us that Charles would be fired immediately. He offered us a full refund and free tours for life. But honestly, I don't think I'll ever want to set foot on a mountain again. It's been weeks, and I'm still having nightmares about Charles's crazed eyes and that feeling of utter helplessness on the mountain. Lana's ankle is slowly healing, but I'm not sure the psychological scars will ever fade completely. I keep replaying it all in my head, wondering if there were warning signs we missed, if we could have done anything differently. I know rationally that Charles's actions weren't our fault. Whatever personal crisis he was going through, he had no right to put us in danger like that. But I can't shake this lingering fear. If someone we trusted to keep us safe could turn on us so suddenly, who can we really trust? I'm sharing this story as a warning to others. Always trust your instincts, and don't be afraid to speak up if something feels off, even with someone in a position of authority. We were lucky to make it off that mountain unharmed. I shudder to think how differently things could have ended. The wilderness can be dangerous enough on its own. You should never have to fear the person who's supposed to be keeping you safe. I hope no one else ever has to go through what Lana and I experienced that day on Cathedral Mountain. Some scars may fade with time, but I know I'll never look at a mountain the same way again. It was the winter of 1874, and I had foolishly agreed to guide a group of 5 prospectors through the treacherous San Juan Mountains of Colorado. I wasn't really qualified for the job, but times were tough and I needed the money. Little did I know the horrors that awaited us. We set out in early February, despite warnings about the harsh weather. I figured we could make it through before the worst of the storms hit. God, how wrong I was. Within days, we were engulfed by raging blizzards that made progress nearly impossible. The snow was waist-deep in places, and the biting wind cut through our clothes like knives. Our meager supplies quickly dwindled as we struggled through the wilderness. The other men, Shannon, Bell, Noon, Miller, and Humphrey, grew increasingly angry with me for leading them into this mess. I could see the accusation in their eyes as we huddled around our pitiful campfires each night, trying in vain to keep warm. After about 2 weeks, we were completely lost, and our food was almost gone. The others talked about turning back, but I knew we'd never make it. Our only hope was to push on and try to reach some kind of civilization. But as the days dragged on, that hope faded. One night, as we lay shivering in our makeshift shelter, I overheard Shannon and Bell whispering about abandoning me. They blamed me for everything and thought they'd have a better chance without me slowing them down. A spark of rage ignited in my chest. How dare they plot against me after I'd done my best to keep us all alive? The next morning, while the others were still asleep, I confronted Shannon. He denied everything at first, but soon we were shouting at each other. In my anger and desperation, I grabbed my rifle and struck him hard across the face. He fell to the ground, blood streaming from his nose and mouth. The others woke up and crowded around us, yelling in confusion. Everything after that is a blur of violence and madness. In the chaos, I lashed out wildly with my rifle. By the time I came to my senses, all 5 men lay dead in the snow around me. I stood there panting, splattered with blood, overwhelmed by what I'd done. As the full weight of my actions sank in, I was gripped by panic. I was alone in the wilderness, days from help, with no food left. That's when the unthinkable thought entered my mind. I had to eat them to survive. The first bite was the hardest. I retched and nearly passed out. But driven by hunger and the will to live, I forced myself to continue. I butchered the bodies as best I could, cooking the meat over our small fire. With each day that passed, it became easier. I told myself I had no choice. I rationed the gruesome meat carefully, knowing it was my only chance at survival. For nearly 2 months, I subsisted on the flesh of my former companions as I slowly made my way through the mountains. The guilt and horror of what I was doing gnawed at me constantly, but the drive to live was stronger. Finally, in early April, I stumbled into a camp of Native Americans. They took pity on me and nursed me back to health, though I kept the terrible truth of how I'd survived to myself. Eventually, I made my way back to civilization, where my story began to unravel. At first, I tried to claim the others had died of exposure and starvation, but suspicions grew as inconsistencies in my tale emerged. When a search party found the butchered remains of the 5 men, the awful truth came to light. I was arrested and put on trial for murder. The trial was a sensation, with newspapers dubbing me the Man-Eater and Colorado Cannibal. I maintained that I had only killed in self-defense and eaten the men after they were already dead. But the jury didn't believe me. I was convicted and sentenced to 40 years in prison. I served 18 years before being released on parole. Even now, decades later, I'm haunted by what happened in those mountains. The faces of Shannon, Bell, Noon, Miller, and Humphrey still visit me in my nightmares. I know what I did was monstrous, but I truly believed it was my only chance to survive. Some nights, I still wake up in a cold sweat, the taste of human flesh lingering in my mouth. The guilt and shame will follow me to my grave. I can never undo what I've done, but I hope that by sharing my story, others might learn from my terrible mistakes. The wilderness can drive men to madness and unspeakable acts. I pray no one else ever has to make the choices I did. I'm an old man now, but those 2 months in the San Juan Mountains will be with me forever. It's a burden I'll carry for the rest of my days. May God have mercy on my soul for the lives I took and the taboo I broke in my desperation to survive. I never thought I'd be writing about something like this, but I need to get it off my chest. I'm still shaken up just thinking about it. It was supposed to be a normal day of food deliveries. As a single mom, I rely on this gig work to make ends meet. My daughter was at school, so I figured I'd get in a few hours of deliveries before picking her up. Everything was going smoothly until I got an order for a house just a few blocks from mine. I recognized the address. It belonged to a woman I'd seen around the neighborhood but never really interacted with. She always seemed a bit off, but I tried not to judge. I pulled up to her house and grabbed the food from my car. As I walked up the driveway, I noticed all the curtains were drawn despite it being midday. The yard was overgrown and littered with random junk. I got an uneasy feeling but pushed it aside. Just drop off the food and go, I told myself. I rang the doorbell and waited. After a minute, I heard shuffling inside. The door creaked open just a crack, and I saw a bloodshot eye peering out at me. Hello, I stammered, holding up the bag of food. Delivery for Sandra? The eye narrowed, darting back and forth. Who sent you? A raspy voice demanded. I'm just delivering your food order from Joe's Diner, I explained, confused. I didn't order any food, she hissed. You're lying. Who are you really? My heart started racing. There must be some mistake. I can just take it back. Suddenly, the door flew open. The woman lunged at me, grabbing my arm. Tell me who sent you, she shrieked. I yanked my arm away and stumbled backwards. I'm sorry. There's been a mix-up. I'm leaving now. As I hurried to my car, I heard her yelling behind me. I know what you're up to. You can't fool me. My hands were shaking as I got in and locked the doors. What the hell just happened? I sat there for a moment, trying to calm down. It was just a misunderstanding, I told myself. She's clearly not well. Let it go. I continued with my deliveries, but I couldn't shake my unease. Every time I approached a house, I felt on edge. By the time I picked up my daughter from school, I was a bundle of nerves. That night, as we were eating dinner, I heard a noise outside. Probably just a raccoon in the trash, I thought. But then came a loud thud against the side of the house. My daughter looked up, alarmed. What was that, Mommy? Stay here, sweetie, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. I'll go check. I peered out the window, and my blood ran cold. There, in my front yard, was the woman from earlier. She was pacing back and forth, muttering to herself and clutching something in her hand. I grabbed my phone to call the police, but stopped when I saw her raise her arm. She hurled whatever she was holding straight at my window. I ducked just as a rock smashed through the glass, showering me with shards. My daughter screamed from the other room. "Mommy, get in the bathroom and lock the door," I yelled, scrambling to my feet. "Don't come out until I say so." I could hear the woman outside, ranting incoherently. More rocks pelted the house. I dialed 911 with shaking hands. "Please hurry," I begged the operator. "She's trying to break in. I have a child here." The next few minutes were the longest of my life. I barricaded myself in the hallway outside the bathroom, listening to the sounds of destruction. What if she got inside before help arrived? How would I protect my little girl? Finally, I heard sirens approaching. The woman's shouts turned to screams as the police arrived. I sagged against the wall in relief. When it was over, I found out the full story. The woman, Sandra, suffered from severe paranoid delusions. She'd stopped taking her medication and had convinced herself that I was part of some conspiracy against her. The food delivery had triggered an episode. The police took her into custody, and she was admitted for psychiatric treatment. They assured me she'd be getting the help she needed. But even weeks later, I can't shake the fear. I keep replaying that moment when the rock came crashing through my window. What if I hadn't ducked in time? What if she'd managed to break in? I've installed security cameras and alarms. I'm jumpy at every little noise. My daughter still has nightmares. I know Sandra was sick and didn't mean to hurt us, but it's hard to feel safe in my own home anymore. I never imagined something like this could happen in our quiet little neighborhood. It just goes to show you never really know what's going on behind closed doors. I'm trying to move past it and not let fear control our lives. But some days are harder than others. I find myself constantly looking over my shoulder, wondering if the next delivery could be my last. I guess I'm sharing this as a reminder to trust your instincts. If something feels off, listen to that little voice inside. And please, if you're struggling with mental health issues, don't be afraid to reach out for help. You never know whose life you might be impacting. For now, I'm focusing on healing and moving forward. But I don't think I'll ever forget that night when our sense of safety was shattered by a stranger's delusions. It's a chilling reminder of how fragile our peace can be. It was around 9 p.m. on a Tuesday when I got the delivery request. The address was in a quiet suburban neighborhood, the kind of place where nothing bad ever seems to happen. I remember thinking it was a bit late for a food order, but didn't think much of it at the time. If only I'd trusted my gut instinct. As I pulled up to the house, I noticed all the lights were off. That should have been my first red flag, but I figured maybe they just like to eat in the dark or something. I grabbed the food and walked up to the front door, Jake's golden retriever Max padding along beside me. He was a great dog, always so friendly and eager to come along on deliveries. I rang the doorbell and waited. No answer. I rang again and knocked, starting to feel a little uneasy. Just as I was about to give up and leave, I heard footsteps inside. The door opened, but only a crack. A man's voice called out, "Sorry, can you leave it on the porch? I'm not decent." Something felt off, but I couldn't put my finger on it. "No problem," I replied, setting the bag down. "Have a good night." As I turned to leave, I heard the door open wider behind me. Before I could react, someone grabbed me from behind, trying to drag me into the house. Pure adrenaline kicked in, and I started thrashing wildly, somehow managing to break free. As I stumbled backwards, I saw 3 men rushing out of the house towards me. One was wielding what looked like a baseball bat. My heart nearly stopped. Max started barking furiously, putting himself between me and the attackers. In that split second, I made a decision that probably saved my life. I turned and ran as fast as I could around the side of the house, Max right on my heels. I could hear angry shouts and pounding footsteps behind us as we sprinted through the backyard. My mind was racing, trying to figure out where to go. The street was too exposed. They'd catch us for sure. Then I spotted a partially open window on the back of the house next door. Without thinking, I boosted Max through the window and scrambled in after him, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. I slammed the window shut just as I heard the men round the corner of the house. For what felt like an eternity, I crouched there in the darkness, barely daring to breathe. I could hear them searching outside, their voices low and angry. Max pressed against me, whimpering softly. I buried my face in his fur, praying they wouldn't find us. After what must have been 15 or 20 minutes, the voices faded away. But I was too terrified to move. What if they were still out there waiting? What if this was another trap? My mind kept replaying those awful moments over and over. As my eyes adjusted to the darkness, I realized we were in someone's living room. The house seemed empty. No lights, no sounds, no sign of life. I fumbled for my phone with shaking hands, desperate to call for help. But my heart sank when I saw there was no signal. Of course, just my luck. I don't know how long I sat there, paralyzed with fear. It could have been minutes or hours. Every creak and rustle made me jump. I kept imagining those men bursting in at any moment. Max stayed close, as if sensing my terror. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I had to do something. Moving as quietly as I could, I crept through the house, searching for a landline phone. But there was nothing. No furniture, no appliances, nothing. It was completely empty. That's when it hit me. This must be a vacant house for sale. I was trapped in an empty house with no way to call for help. The realization made me want to scream, but I forced myself to stay calm. Panicking wouldn't help. I tried the front door, but it was locked. Same with the back door. All the windows were shut tight, too. It was like being in a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. I slumped to the floor, my mind racing. What if the owners came to check on the house? What if those men came back? What if no one ever found us? Hours crawled by. I dozed fitfully, jolting awake at every sound. Max stayed by my side, a warm, comforting presence in the darkness. As the first light of dawn began to filter through the windows, I finally felt safe enough to try leaving. Heart in my throat, I eased the front door open and peered out. The street was quiet and empty. No sign of those men or anyone else. Taking a deep breath, I whistled softly for Max, and we slipped out of the house. I've never moved so fast in my life. We practically ran the whole way back to Jake's place. Once inside, I locked every door and window, then collapsed on the couch in exhaustion. It took hours before I felt calm enough to call the police. They took my statement, but without any real evidence, there wasn't much they could do. They said it was probably just some punks trying to scare me. But I know what I saw. Those men weren't playing around. They meant to do real harm. It's been weeks now, but I still have nightmares about that night. I keep replaying all the what-ifs in my mind. What if I hadn't been able to break free? What if we hadn't found that open window? What if they had caught us? I quit the delivery job, obviously. I can't even order food for delivery anymore without having a panic attack. Jake says I should talk to someone, get some help processing the trauma. Maybe he's right. But for now, I'm just trying to get through each day, grateful to be alive. I don't know why those men targeted me or that house. Was it random, or had they been watching me? Were they after me specifically, or just looking for an easy victim? I'll probably never know, but one thing's for sure. I'll never take my safety for granted again. You never know what dangers might be lurking behind a seemingly ordinary situation. So if you're out there doing deliveries or any kind of job where you're going to strangers' homes, please be careful. Trust your instincts. If something feels off, it probably is. Don't be afraid to leave or call for help. It's better to seem paranoid than to end up in a situation like I did. I'm trying to move on with my life, but part of me will always be that terrified guy huddled in a dark, empty house, wondering if I'd live to see morning. I guess all I can do now is be grateful for the second chance I got, and hope that by sharing my story, maybe I can help someone else avoid a similar fate. Stay safe out there, everyone. You never know what might be waiting behind a closed door. I grabbed the pizza and walked up to the main entrance. There was a note taped to the door that said, "Delivery, use side entrance." I thought it was a little odd, but not unheard of for office buildings after hours. I walked around to the side of the building, my footsteps echoing in the empty parking lot. The side door was propped open slightly. I called out, "Pizza delivery," as I pushed it open, but got no response. The hallway inside was pitch black. I fumbled for my phone to use as a flashlight, feeling uneasy. "Hello? Pizza delivery," I called out again, my voice sounding small in the darkness. I took a few steps down the hall, pizza box in one hand and phone in the other. Suddenly, I heard rapid footsteps behind me. Before I could turn around, something slammed into the back of my head. Blinding pain exploded through my skull as I crashed to the floor. The pizza box went flying as I desperately tried to cover my head. More blows rained down on me as I curled into a ball. I could hear myself screaming, but it sounded far away. Through the haze of pain, I realized I was being beaten with what felt like a wooden plank or board. I managed to roll onto my back and caught a glimpse of a dark figure looming over me. He was wearing all black with a mask covering his face. "Please stop," I begged. "Take whatever you want. Just don't kill me." The attack paused for a moment. I heard heavy breathing, then hands roughly searching my pockets. My wallet, phone, and car keys were ripped away. "Where's the rest?" a male voice growled. "That's all I have, I swear," I sobbed. "Please don't hurt me anymore." There was a long, terrifying pause. I braced myself for more blows, but instead I heard footsteps retreating rapidly down the hall. The side door slammed shut, leaving me alone in the darkness. I lay there for what felt like hours, afraid to move. Every part of my body throbbed with pain. My head was spinning, and I felt nauseous. Eventually, I managed to drag myself to my feet, using the wall for support. I staggered back outside, disoriented and in shock. My car was still in the parking lot, but without my keys, I had no way to drive it. I limped to the street and flagged down a passing car. The elderly couple inside looked horrified when they saw me. They called 911 and waited with me until the police and ambulance arrived. The next few hours passed in a blur of police questions and medical exams. I had a concussion, bruised ribs, and cuts and bruises all over. The police searched the building but found no sign of my attacker. They told me it was likely a premeditated trap. Someone had called in a fake delivery order to lure a victim to the empty building. I spent the night in the hospital for observation. When I was released the next day, I found out the story had made the local news. The property management company that owned the office building reached out, horrified that their premises had been used for such a violent crime. They offered to cover my medical bills and lost wages. It's been a few weeks now, and I'm still struggling to process what happened. I have nightmares about that dark hallway and wake up in a cold sweat. Loud noises make me jump. I can't bring myself to do delivery work anymore. Just the thought of going to an unfamiliar address fills me with panic. The police still haven't caught the guy who attacked me. They think he may have done this to other delivery drivers in the area. I can't help but wonder if he's still out there, waiting to lure in his next victim. The attack only lasted a few minutes, but it's left me with scars, both physical and mental, that will take a long time to heal. I know I'm lucky to be alive. If I had fought back, or if the attacker had been more violent, things could have ended much worse. But I'm angry too. Angry that someone would prey on workers just trying to do their jobs. Angry that I can't feel safe doing something as simple as delivering a pizza. The whole experience has made me realize how vulnerable delivery drivers and other service workers can be. We're often sent to unfamiliar locations, sometimes late at night, with no way to verify if a call is legitimate. I've heard from other drivers who've had close calls or dangerous encounters. It seems like more needs to be done to protect workers in these situations. For now, I'm focusing on healing and trying to move forward with my life. I've started seeing a therapist to work through the trauma. I'm looking for a new job that doesn't involve deliveries. The property management company has installed better lighting and security cameras at that office building. It's a small comfort, but at least it might prevent someone else from going through what I did. I still have so many unanswered questions. Who was that masked man? Why did he target me? Was it random or planned? Will he strike again? I may never know the full story of what happened that night. All I can do is share my experience and hope it serves as a warning to others. Stay alert, trust your instincts, and remember that no delivery is worth risking your life. The memories of that night still haunt me. The sound of footsteps in the dark, the searing pain of each blow, the attacker's growling voice demanding more. Sometimes I wake up in a panic, thinking I'm back in that pitch-black hallway. It's going to be a long road to feeling normal again, but I'm determined to not let this define me. I refuse to live in fear forever. Slowly but surely, I'm reclaiming my life. Each day I get a little stronger, a little braver. I know the scars will always be there, but they don't have to control me. I survived that night, and I'll survive the aftermath too. If there's one thing I've learned from this ordeal, it's to never take your safety for granted. A routine night at work turned into a nightmare in the blink of an eye. I hope my story can help raise awareness about the dangers delivery drivers face. Maybe it will lead to better safety measures and protections for workers. If even one person avoids a similar fate by being more cautious, then sharing this painful experience will have been worth it. To anyone reading this who works in delivery or other vulnerable jobs, please be careful out there. Trust your gut if a situation feels off. Don't be afraid to refuse a delivery that seems unsafe. Your life is worth more than any pizza or package. And to those ordering deliveries, please be considerate of the workers bringing you your food. A well-lit entrance and clear directions can make a huge difference. I don't know if I'll ever fully understand why this happened to me, but I'm choosing to focus on healing and moving forward. Life is precious, and I'm grateful for a second chance. To anyone else who's been through trauma, you're not alone. There is hope and healing on the other side. Stay strong and keep fighting. We are more resilient than we know. I opened the door to find a young woman, probably in her early 20s, holding our food. She looked nervous and kept glancing over her shoulder. "Hi, here's your order," she said quickly, thrusting the bag at me. As I reached for my wallet, she suddenly blurted out, "I'm sorry, but I think someone's been following me on my deliveries tonight. Would it be okay if I came inside for a minute?" Her voice was shaking. I hesitated for a second, but she looked so scared that I nodded and stepped aside to let her in. Tom came over, looking confused. "What's going on?" he asked. The delivery girl, Emma, according to her name tag, was visibly trembling now. "I'm so sorry to bother you," she said. "It's just, I've had this weird feeling all night that someone's been tailing me in a black SUV. At first I thought I was being paranoid, but I've seen the same vehicle at least 4 times now." Tom and I exchanged worried glances. "Have you called the police?" I asked. Emma shook her head. "I wasn't sure if I should. I mean, I don't have any real proof. But then on the way here, I thought I saw the SUV parked down the street and I just panicked." "You did the right thing coming to us," Tom reassured her. "Why don't you sit down and we'll call the police just to be safe?" Emma nodded gratefully and sank onto our couch. I grabbed my phone to dial 911, but before I could, we heard a loud crash from the backyard. Tom jumped up. "What the hell was that?" "Oh, God," Emma whimpered. "What if it's him?" My heart was racing. Tom moved towards the back door, but I grabbed his arm. "Don't go out there," I hissed. Just then, we saw a dark figure dart past the kitchen window. Emma let out a strangled cry, and I felt my blood run cold. There was someone in our yard. Tom ran to lock the back door while I finally managed to dial 911 with shaking hands. "There's an intruder in our backyard," I told the dispatcher, my voice barely above a whisper. "Please hurry." The next few minutes were agonizing. We huddled in the living room, jumping at every little sound. Emma was sobbing quietly, and I was trying not to completely lose it myself. Tom had grabbed a kitchen knife and was standing tensely by the front window, peering out into the darkness. Suddenly, he stiffened. "There's definitely someone out there," he muttered. "I just saw movement by the garage." I felt sick. Our quiet suburban home had turned into a house of horrors in a matter of minutes. I kept expecting the intruder to come crashing through a window at any moment. After what felt like an eternity, we finally heard sirens in the distance. Tom let out a shaky breath. "Thank God," he said, but our relief was short-lived. Just as the police cars pulled up, we heard the sound of breaking glass from the guest bedroom. Emma screamed, and I felt my legs go weak. He was inside the house. Tom shoved us towards the front door. "Go! Get out now!" he yelled. We burst out onto the front lawn just as 2 police officers were approaching. "He's in the house!" I cried hysterically, pointing back at our home. Everything happened so fast after that. More police cars arrived and officers swarmed our property with guns drawn. Tom, Emma, and I huddled behind a patrol car, watching in disbelief as the scene unfolded. After a tense standoff, they finally apprehended the intruder, a tall man dressed all in black. As they led him to a squad car in handcuffs, I got a glimpse of his face. He was younger than I expected, probably mid-30s, with cold, dead eyes that sent chills down my spine. We spent the next couple hours giving statements to the police. It turned out the man had been stalking and harassing several female delivery drivers in the area. Emma had been his latest target. He'd followed her to our house and had been planning to grab her when she left. The crash we'd heard was him knocking over our grill as he tried to hide in the backyard. By the time everything was wrapped up, it was nearly 2 a.m. The police offered to put us up in a hotel, but we decided to stay with my parents, who only lived a few miles away. I couldn't bear the thought of spending the night in our house after what had happened. As we drove away, I kept replaying the night's events in my mind. How quickly things had spiraled out of control. How close we'd come to real danger. I thought about Emma and how terrified she must have been, knowing someone was stalking her all night. I was so glad we'd been able to help her, even if it meant going through that horrifying ordeal. It's been a few weeks now, and we're slowly getting back to normal. We've upgraded our home security system, and I'm definitely more cautious about opening the door to strangers, but mostly I'm just incredibly grateful that we're all safe. I still think about that night often, how a simple food delivery turned into the scariest experience of my life. I don't think I'll ever take my safety for granted again, and I'll certainly never look at takeout the same way. You just never know when a mundane moment might suddenly turn into something much more sinister. I was living in a shared house with 3 other roommates at the time. We were all in our early 20s, working entry-level jobs and trying to save money. The house wasn't anything special, just a small 2-story place in a quiet neighborhood. But it was home. That weekend, all my roommates had plans out of town. Jake was visiting family, Megan was at a bachelorette party, and Chris was on a camping trip with his girlfriend. I was the only one staying behind because I had to work. Friday night was uneventful. I ordered takeout, watched some Netflix, and went to bed early. Saturday was more of the same. I worked a morning shift at the coffee shop, then came home and spent the afternoon playing video games. As evening rolled around, I started getting hungry. I was debating whether to cook or order in when I heard a weird scratching noise coming from upstairs. At first I thought it was just the house settling or something, but then I heard it again, louder this time. It sounded like it was coming from one of the bedrooms. My heart started racing. I knew I was alone in the house. I grabbed a heavy flashlight from the kitchen drawer and slowly made my way upstairs, straining my ears. When I reached the top of the stairs, I could definitely hear movement coming from Chris's room at the end of the hall. I inched closer, gripping the flashlight so hard my knuckles turned white. The scratching noise was clearer now. It sounded like someone trying to open the window from the outside. I froze, unsure what to do. Should I confront them? Call the police? Run? Before I could decide, I heard a muffled voice say, "Almost got it." It was a man's voice, unfamiliar. Panic flooded through me. This was really happening. Someone was breaking in. I don't know what came over me, but something in me snapped. Maybe it was adrenaline. Maybe it was anger at the violation of our home. But I found myself striding forward and flinging open Chris's door. The window was half open, and a man was awkwardly trying to climb through. He looked up, startled, when I burst in. In that moment of eye contact, I recognized him. It was Z, this sketchy guy Chris knew from high school who'd come by the house a few times. Always gave me bad vibes. "What the fuck are you doing?" I yelled, brandishing the flashlight like a weapon. Z's eyes went wide. "Shit," he muttered. He tried to back out the window, but he was awkwardly positioned and couldn't move quickly. That's when I noticed there was someone else outside, a woman trying to help push Z through the window. She looked terrified when she saw me. "Get the fuck out of here," I shouted, stepping closer. My voice was shaking, but I tried to sound as intimidating as possible. "I'm calling the cops right now." Z finally managed to extract himself from the window frame. He and the woman practically fell over themselves, scrambling down the drain pipe. I slammed the window shut and locked it, then ran to check all the other windows and doors in the house. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely dial 911. I gave them a description of Z and the woman, then paced anxiously waiting for the police to arrive. It felt like hours, but was probably only about 10 minutes before I heard sirens. 2 officers came to take my statement. They seemed to take it seriously. Once I mentioned I recognized one of the intruders. "Do you know why this Z person might have been trying to break in?" one of the officers asked. I shook my head. "No idea. I mean, he's been here before as a guest of my roommate. But I don't know why he'd try to break in when no one's home." The officer nodded gravely. "Unfortunately, we see this sometimes. Acquaintances who know the layout of a home and when it might be empty. They think it makes for an easy target." That thought made my skin crawl. How long had Z been watching our house, waiting for an opportunity? The police took down all the information and said they'd be on the lookout for Z and his accomplice. They also did a thorough check of the property to make sure no one was still lurking around. After they left, I couldn't bring myself to go to sleep. I stayed up all night with all the lights on, jumping at every little noise. I must have triple-checked every lock a dozen times. The next morning, I got a call from the police. They'd found Z and the woman trying to pawn some electronics at a shop across town. Both were arrested for attempted burglary. I felt a wave of relief knowing they were in custody. But I still couldn't shake the feeling of violation. This was someone we knew, someone we'd let into our home before, and he tried to rob us. When my roommates got back, they were shocked. Chris especially seemed shaken. He kept saying he never thought Z was capable of something like that. We all felt betrayed and vulnerable. In the weeks that followed, we beefed up security. New locks, alarm system, security cameras. But it didn't erase the lingering unease. I found myself constantly looking over my shoulder, startling at unexpected noises. It's been months now, and things have mostly gone back to normal. Z is awaiting trial. We've all mostly moved on with our lives. But sometimes, late at night, I still hear that scratching at the window. I don't know if I'll ever feel truly safe in my own home again. I guess the lesson is, you can never be too careful, even with people you think you know. Trust your instincts. And always, always lock your windows. I'd been working as a food delivery driver for about 6 months, mostly to make some extra cash on the side. It was a pretty easy gig. Pick up orders from restaurants, drop them off to customers, rinse and repeat. But this particular delivery was different from the start. It was around 11 p.m. on a Tuesday night. I'd just finished dropping off an order when I got a ping for a new delivery. The destination was an old apartment building downtown that I'd never been to before. As I drove there, I noticed the streets getting emptier and the buildings looking more run down. When I pulled up to the address, I felt a chill run down my spine. The building was this decrepit 5-story walk-up that looked like it should have been condemned years ago. Graffiti covered the walls and most of the windows were boarded up. I double-checked the address, hoping I'd made a mistake. But nope, this was definitely the place. I got out of my car, grabbing the bag of food. The order was just a single cheeseburger and fries from a 24-hour diner. As I approached the entrance, I noticed there was no buzzer system or anything, just a heavy metal door that was propped open slightly. I reluctantly went inside, my footsteps echoing in the empty lobby. The fluorescent lights flickered ominously overhead. That's when I checked the delivery instructions and felt my stomach drop. Go to basement. Unit B4. Knock 3 times. Leave food outside door. Basement? I hadn't even realized this place had a basement. Every instinct was screaming at me to turn around and leave. But I needed this job and was worried about getting a bad review if I didn't complete the delivery. So against my better judgment, I started looking for stairs leading down. It took me a few minutes of wandering the dim hallways before I found a door marked Basement Access. I hesitated, then pushed it open. A gust of musty air hit me as I peered down the dark stairwell. The lights didn't seem to be working down there. I pulled out my phone and turned on the flashlight. The beam illuminated crumbling concrete steps descending into pitch blackness. My heart was pounding as I slowly made my way down, one hand on the grimy wall to steady myself. When I reached the bottom, I swept my light around. I was in a narrow corridor lined with rusty pipes and peeling paint. Water dripped somewhere in the darkness. The silence was oppressive. I started walking, looking for Unit B4. The basement seemed to stretch on forever, twisting and turning. I passed doors marked B1, B2, B3. My palms were sweating as I gripped the food bag tighter. Finally, I saw it. Unit B4 at the very end of the hallway. I approached cautiously, my light revealing a battered metal door with peeling red paint. Following the instructions, I knocked 3 times. The sound echoed eerily in the silence. I waited, heart racing, but there was no response. After a minute, I set the bag down in front of the door. I was about to turn and leave when I heard it, a faint scratching noise from inside the apartment. I froze, straining to listen. The scratching got louder, like something was scrabbling at the other side of the door. Then I heard a low, guttural moan that made my blood run cold. Panic seized me and I started backing away. But before I could turn to run, the door suddenly flew open. A pale, emaciated arm shot out, grasping at empty air. I caught a glimpse of a gaunt face with sunken eyes in the darkness beyond. I stumbled backwards, my scream catching in my throat. The figure lurched forward into the hallway. In the beam of my flashlight, I saw matted hair, rotting teeth, and skin stretched tight over bones. The smell of decay hit me like a wave. "Help! Me!" the thing croaked, shuffling towards me with jerky movements. Terror propelled me into action. I spun around and sprinted back the way I'd come, my light bobbing wildly. I could hear ragged breathing and uneven footsteps behind me. I flew up the stairs, taking them 2 at a time. My lungs were burning as I burst out into the lobby. I didn't slow down, just ran full tilt for the exit. As I reached for the door handle, a hand clamped down on my shoulder. I whirled around, coming face to face with a man I hadn't noticed before. He was tall and gaunt, with deep-set eyes and a predatory grin. "Going somewhere?" he asked in a raspy voice. His grip tightened painfully. I lashed out instinctively, my fist connecting with his jaw. He stumbled back and I wrenched the door open, bolting outside. I sprinted to my car, fumbling with my keys. I could see the man emerging from the building as I finally got the door unlocked. I dove inside, slammed the door, and peeled out of there as fast as I could. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely grip the steering wheel. I kept checking my rearview mirror, terrified I was being followed. I drove aimlessly for almost an hour, too afraid to go home in case they'd somehow gotten my information. When I finally calmed down enough, I went straight to the police station. The cops listened to my story, but I could tell they didn't really believe me. They took down my statement and said they'd look into it, but I knew they probably wouldn't do much. I begged them to at least check out the basement apartment, but they just said they'd send a patrol by to investigate. I quit my delivery job the next day. For weeks afterwards, I had nightmares about what I'd seen in that basement. I kept obsessively checking the news, hoping to see some story about an arrest or rescue, but there was nothing. Sometimes I wonder if I imagined the whole thing, but then I remember the rotten smell, the inhuman noises, the feeling of that bony hand on my shoulder, and I know it was real. I still avoid that part of town, and I never, ever make deliveries after dark anymore. The world can be a dangerous place, especially for those of us just trying to make an honest living. You never know what horrors might be lurking behind a closed door. Around 10 p.m., I got assigned a delivery to a house on the outskirts of town. I'd never been to that area before, and as I punched the address into my GPS, I felt a twinge of unease. The location seemed pretty isolated, but I shrugged it off. After all, I'd done plenty of late-night deliveries without any issues. As I drove further away from the city lights, the roads became darker and more winding. The houses were few and far between, separated by large stretches of dense forest. My old sedan's headlights seemed weak against the pitch-black night. I kept checking my phone, hoping I hadn't lost signal, but the blue dot on the map kept moving forward. After about 20 minutes of driving, I finally arrived at the address. It was a large, old house set back from the road, barely visible through the trees. There were no lights on, and I couldn't see any cars in the driveway. For a moment, I considered calling the restaurant to double-check the order, but I didn't want to seem paranoid or unprofessional. I grabbed the pizza bag and made my way up the overgrown path to the front door. My heart was pounding, though I tried to convince myself I was just being silly. I rang the doorbell and waited, straining my ears for any sound of movement inside. After what felt like an eternity, the door creaked open. A tall man, probably in his late 40s, stood there. He had a scruffy beard and was wearing a stained white tank top. His eyes seemed to bore right through me, and I felt my skin crawl. Pizza delivery," I stammered, trying to keep my voice steady. He grunted and reached for his wallet, all the while staring at me intently. As he handed me the money, his fingers lingered on mine for a second too long. I quickly gave him the pizza and turned to leave, eager to get back to my car. "Hey!" he called out as I was halfway down the path. "You shouldn't be out here all alone at night. It's not safe for a pretty young thing like you." I mumbled something about being fine and picked up my pace. As I reached my car, I heard his heavy footsteps behind me. Panic rising in my throat, I fumbled with my keys. "Let me help you," he said, his voice way too close now. "Your car might not start in this cold. I've got some tools inside if you need them." "No, thank you," I said firmly, finally managing to unlock the door. "I really need to get back to work." I practically jumped into the driver's seat and locked the doors. Through the rearview mirror, I could see him standing there, watching me. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely get the key in the ignition. To my horror, the engine sputtered and died when I tried to start it. I tried again, my panic mounting with each failed attempt. On the third try, it finally roared to life. I threw the car into reverse and peeled out of there as fast as I could. As I sped down the dark road, my headlights illuminated something that made my blood run cold. There was another car pulling out from a hidden driveway just ahead, and it was coming straight for me. I swerved hard, narrowly avoiding a collision, and caught a glimpse of the driver. It was him. My mind raced as I pushed my old car to its limits, taking sharp turns at dangerous speeds. The headlights behind me never seemed to fade, always right there in my rearview mirror. I was sobbing now, terrified and unsure of where I was going. The trees all looked the same in the darkness, and I had no idea if I was even heading in the right direction. At one point, I thought I'd lost him. The road behind me was dark, and I allowed myself a moment of relief. But then I saw headlights appear in the distance, gaining on me quickly. It was like he knew these roads better than I did, taking shortcuts I couldn't see. I don't know how long this chase went on. It felt like hours, but it was probably only 20 or 30 minutes. My gas gauge was dangerously low, and I knew I couldn't keep this up much longer. Just when I thought all hope was lost, I saw lights ahead. Civilization. Safety. I burst onto a main road, my tires screeching as I made the turn. There were other cars around now, and I felt a wave of relief wash over me. I glanced in my rearview mirror one last time, half expecting to see those haunting headlights, but there was nothing. He was gone. I drove straight to the police station, my hands still shaking as I parked the car. The officers were kind and took my statement, but without a clear description of the man or his vehicle, there wasn't much they could do. They advised me to be more careful about late-night deliveries and suggested I carry pepper spray. I quit my job at the pizza place the next day. No amount of money was worth going through that terror again. For weeks afterward, I jumped at every sound and couldn't sleep without the lights on. Even now, months later, I still get anxious when I have to drive at night or when I'm alone in an unfamiliar place. The thing that haunts me most is not knowing why he targeted me or what might have happened if I hadn't managed to escape. Was it just random, or had he been watching the pizza place, waiting for a vulnerable target? I'll never know for sure. I've shared this story as a warning to others, especially women working in delivery or other jobs that require them to be alone in potentially dangerous situations. Trust your instincts, always be aware of your surroundings, and don't be afraid to refuse a delivery if something feels off. No job is worth risking your safety. To this day, I can't drive past that area of town without feeling a chill run down my spine. Sometimes, when I'm lying awake at night, I swear I can hear the sound of an engine in the distance, and for a split second, I'm back on that dark road, running for my life. It's a night I'll never forget, a reminder of how quickly an ordinary situation can turn into a nightmare. The day started like any other Saturday shift. I arrived at 4 p.m. to help with the dinner rush, tying on my apron and pulling my hair back into a ponytail. The familiar smell of tomato sauce and melted cheese filled the air as I got to work, taking orders and serving pizzas. Around 7 p.m., I noticed him walk in, Johnny. My stomach instantly knotted up. He was a regular customer, probably in his late 30s, who always gave me the creeps. He'd come in a few times a week, always sitting at the counter and trying to chat me up. At first I just thought he was being friendly, but over time his comments became more and more inappropriate. "Hey, beautiful, how about you and me go out sometime?" he'd say with a slimy grin. Or he'd accidentally brush against me as I walked by. I'd told my manager Mike about it, but he just shrugged it off. "He's harmless," Mike had said. "Just ignore him." But Johnny wasn't harmless, and I couldn't just ignore the way his eyes followed me around the restaurant, undressing me. I'd started dreading my shifts, wondering if he'd show up. That night, Johnny took his usual seat at the counter. I tried to avoid him, letting the other waitress handle his order. But as the dinner rush died down, I found myself alone up front, while my co-workers were in the back prepping for closing. "Come on, sweetheart, don't be so cold," Johnny called out. "Why don't you come over here and keep me company?" I pretended I didn't hear him, busying myself with wiping down tables. My hands were shaking slightly. I wished Mike was still there, but he'd left early, leaving us to close up. "I'm talking to you." Johnny's voice had an edge to it now. I glanced over and saw anger in his eyes. My heart started racing. I'm sorry. I'm busy cleaning up," I stammered. "We're closing soon." Johnny stood up abruptly, his chair scraping loudly across the floor. Before I could react, he was right in front of me, grabbing my wrist. "Don't walk away from me," he snarled. His grip was painfully tight. I could smell alcohol on his breath. "Let go of me." I tried to pull away, but he was too strong. You think you're too good for me, huh? Johnny's face was inches from mine. I've seen the way you flirt with the other customers. You're just a little tease. Panic surged through me. I looked around desperately, but the dining room was empty. My co-workers were all in the back, out of earshot. Please, I begged. You're hurting me. Let me go. Instead of releasing me, Johnny started dragging me towards the back of the restaurant. I stumbled, crying out in pain and fear. He kicked open the door to the storage room and shoved me inside. Now we can have some privacy, he leered. I was truly terrified now. The storage room was small and cramped, filled with shelves of supplies and stacks of pizza boxes. There was barely room to move. Johnny's bulk blocked the doorway, cutting off any escape. No one can hear you back here, he said, advancing towards me. It's just you and me now. I backed up until I hit the wall, my mind racing. I had to do something, but what? Johnny was so much bigger and stronger than me. As he reached for me again, I ducked under his arm and dove behind a stack of boxes. He cursed and lunged after me, knocking over shelves in the process. I scrambled deeper into the maze of storage, trying to put obstacles between us. You can't hide from me, Johnny shouted. I could hear him throwing things around, searching for me. I crouched in a dark corner, trying to make myself as small as possible. Tears streamed down my face as I prayed someone would come looking for me. How long until my co-workers noticed I was missing? Suddenly the door burst open again. What the hell is going on in here? It was Jake, one of the cooks. Jake, help! I cried out. Everything happened so fast after that. Jake yelled for the others. Johnny tried to run, but they caught him. Someone called the police. I sat huddled on the floor, shaking uncontrollably as my co-workers crowded around me. The rest of the night was a blur of police statements and my parents arriving to take me home. I quit my job at Tony's the next day. I couldn't bear the thought of going back there. It's been months, but I still have nightmares about being trapped in that storage room. I jump at unexpected noises and struggle with anxiety in crowded places. Johnny was arrested and charged, but it doesn't erase what happened. I'm sharing this because I want other young women to know they're not alone. Trust your instincts if someone makes you uncomfortable. Don't let anyone tell you it's harmless or that you're overreacting. And if you do find yourself in a dangerous situation, fight back however you can. I'm still processing everything and trying to heal. Some days are harder than others, but I'm getting stronger, and I won't let Johnny or anyone else make me feel powerless again. If my story can help even one other person, then it's worth sharing. I've been working as a stevedore for over 30 years, and I've seen my fair share of weird stuff come through these ports. But nothing could have prepared me for what happened that sweltering August afternoon. The air was thick with humidity, and sweat was pouring down my face as I helped unload crates from a cargo ship that had just come in from South America. My buddy Mike was working alongside me, joking around like usual to pass the time. We were about halfway through the shipment when I heard Mike let out this blood-curdling scream. I whipped around to see what was wrong, and that's when I saw it, this massive, hairy spider crawling up his arm. Now, I'm talking huge. This thing was easily the size of a dinner plate, with thick, bristly legs and these beady little eyes that seemed to be staring right at me. I'd never seen a spider that big outside of a zoo or nature documentary. Mike was frozen in terror, his eyes wide as saucers as this monster arachnid made its way up towards his shoulder. I could see his whole body trembling. "Get it off! Get it off!" He kept yelling, but he seemed paralyzed. unable to even move to swat the thing away. I stood there in shock for a second, my brain trying to process what I was seeing. Then my instincts kicked in, and I rushed over to try and help Mike. "Hold still," I shouted, looking around frantically for something I could use to knock the spider off. I grabbed a nearby clipboard and took a swing at the thing, but I missed. The spider was quicker than I expected. In that split second, the unthinkable happened. The tarantula suddenly leaped from Mike's arm right onto his face. I'll never forget the sound of his muffled screams as that hairy beast clung to his cheek and forehead. Mike's arms were flailing wildly now as he stumbled backwards, crashing into some crates. By this point, the commotion had drawn the attention of the other workers. People came running over to see what was happening, and when they saw the scene unfolding, all hell broke loose. Panic spread through the docks like wildfire. People were shouting and scrambling to get away, terrified that there might be more of these monster spiders hiding in the shipment. I heard someone yell that the spider's bite was deadly poison. In the chaos, I lost sight of Mike for a moment. When I spotted him again, he had managed to pull the spider off his face and fling it to the ground. But he was hyperventilating, his face pale as a ghost. I rushed to his side, my heart pounding out of my chest. "Mike, Mike, are you okay? Did it bite you?" He couldn't even form words, just kept gasping for air and pointing at his cheek where an angry red welt was forming. Someone had called 911, and I could hear sirens approaching in the distance. But every second felt like an eternity as I watched Mike struggle to breathe, wondering if that spider's venom was already coursing through his veins. The paramedics arrived and whisked Mike away to the hospital. The rest of us were left to deal with the aftermath of what had just happened. Work came to a standstill as port authorities and pest control were called in. We spent hours combing through every crate and pallet, searching for any sign of more spiders. The fear and tension were palpable. Every little movement or rustle had us jumping out of our skin, imagining more eight-legged monsters lying in wait. Incredibly, no other spiders were found. It seemed like that one massive tarantula was a lone stowaway. But the damage was done. We were all shaken to our core. I couldn't sleep that night. Images of that horrible spider replaying in my mind every time I closed my eyes. I kept imagining I could feel something crawling on me, making my skin crawl. The next day, we got word that Mike was going to be okay. Turns out the spider's bite, while painful, wasn't actually deadly. He was being kept for observation, but was expected to make a full recovery. It was a huge relief, but it didn't erase the terror of what we'd experienced. For weeks afterwards, everyone at the docks was on edge. We approached each new shipment with trepidation, half expecting more nightmarish creatures to come skittering out. Even now, years later, I can't look at a banana without getting a chill down my spine. That day changed something in me. I've always had a healthy respect for the dangers of my job, but now I know firsthand that sometimes the biggest threats can come in unexpected packages. I still work the docks, but I'm a lot more cautious now, and I always keep an eye out for any unusual movement in the crates we unload, because you never know what might be hiding in the shadows, waiting to pounce. That tarantula encounter was a wake-up call, a reminder that in this line of work, you have to expect the unexpected, but some things you can never truly be prepared for, and the image of that massive spider leaping onto my friend's face is something that will haunt me for the rest of my days. I've known James since we were kids. We grew up in the same small town in East Lothian, Scotland. Everyone knew everyone. You know how it is in places like that. James always had issues. Even back in primary school, there was something off about him. He'd manipulate other kids, start fights, and then play the victim. The teachers always fell for it too. It was like he could twist people around his finger. As we got older, things only got worse. James became more aggressive, more unpredictable. He'd have these explosive outbursts of anger over the smallest things. I remember once in secondary school, he absolutely lost it because someone accidentally bumped into him in the hallway. He ended up putting the poor kid in the hospital. Somehow, he managed to talk his way out of serious consequences, as usual. I hadn't seen much of James in recent years. Last I heard, he was living with his grandparents. They were good people, salt-of-the-earth types. Everyone in town loved them. They'd taken James in when no one else would deal with him anymore. I guess they thought they could help him, straighten him out. If only they'd known. It was the day after Christmas when it happened, Boxing Day. I was at home, recovering from all the holiday food and drink, when I got a frantic call from my mum. She was crying, barely able to get the words out. "James, he's killed them. He's killed his grandparents." I felt like I'd been punched in the gut. My mind went blank. I couldn't process what I was hearing. "What? Mum, slow down. What are you talking about?" She took a deep breath and tried to compose herself. "The police just left. They found James's grandparents dead in their home, stabbed to death. James is in custody. He confessed." I sat down hard, my legs giving out beneath me. This couldn't be real. It had to be some kind of sick joke, but I knew it wasn't. Deep down, a part of me had always feared James would do something like this one day. The details came out over the next few days, and they were even more horrific than I'd imagined. Apparently, it had all started over a Christmas hamper. A fucking hamper. James's grandparents had given him one as a gift, but it had alcohol in it. They knew James had issues with drinking, so they'd asked him not to open it. That was it. That's all it took to set him off. He flew into a rage, screaming at them, calling them every name under the sun. His grandfather tried to calm him down, and James just snapped. He grabbed a kitchen knife and stabbed his grandfather repeatedly. His grandmother tried to intervene, and he turned on her too. The neighbors heard the commotion and called the police, but by the time they arrived, it was too late. Both grandparents were dead, and James was just sitting there in the blood-soaked living room, calm as you please. The whole town was in shock. These were beloved members of our community, murdered in cold blood by their own grandson. And for what? A hamper. But the worst was yet to come. As the case went to trial, James's lawyers started pushing this narrative that he was mentally ill. They claimed he had schizophrenia, that he wasn't in control of his actions. And you know what? It worked. Instead of prison, James got sent to a mental institution. And here's the kicker. I'm convinced that's exactly what he wanted. See, James was always a master manipulator. He knew how to play people, how to get what he wanted. A cushy stay in a mental hospital beats a life sentence in prison any day. I saw him once, after the trial. They were transferring him to the institution, and our eyes met for just a second. And I swear I saw him smirk, just for an instant. But it was there. That's when I knew for sure he'd played us all again. Now, months later, I still can't shake this feeling of wrongness. Two good people are dead, and their killer is probably sitting pretty in some hospital, manipulating the staff just like he's done his whole life. I keep thinking about James's grandparents, how they took him in, tried to help him when no one else would. And this is how he repaid them. It makes me sick to my stomach. Sometimes, late at night, I find myself wondering, what if someone had seen the signs earlier? What if we'd all stopped making excuses for James's behavior years ago? Could this have been prevented? But then I remember that look in his eyes, that smirk, and I realize maybe there was never any hope for James. Maybe he was always going to end up here, one way or another. I don't know if I'll ever be able to make sense of what happened that Boxing Day. All I know is that our little town will never be the same. We've lost our innocence, our sense of safety, and two kind, loving people lost their lives in the most brutal way imaginable, at the hands of someone they loved and tried to help. I guess the lesson here, if there is one, is that sometimes the monsters aren't strangers hiding in the shadows. Sometimes they're right in front of us, wearing familiar faces, and by the time we realize it, it's already too late. I still have nightmares about it. I see James standing there, covered in blood, that knife in his hand. And then he looks at me and smiles, and I wake up in a cold sweat. I don't know if I'll ever be able to forget what happened. I don't know if any of us will. So that's my story. A tale of manipulation, violence, and a justice system that failed two innocent people. I hope writing this down helps me process it all somehow. But right now, all I feel is a deep, overwhelming sadness and a lingering fear that maybe, just maybe, James isn't done yet. I was just a young guy, barely 20 years old, when I found myself stationed at a German POW camp after World War II. The name's Murphy. Yeah, I know, as Irish as they come, but with some German blood too. Maybe that's why they picked me for this assignment. I could understand bits and pieces of German, which turned out to be more crucial than anyone could have imagined. It was a crisp autumn morning in 1945 when everything went down. I remember the smell of pine in the air and the crunch of fallen leaves under my boots as I made my rounds. The camp was eerily quiet that day. Too quiet. You know how they say silence can be deafening? Well, this was it. I was patrolling near the SS prisoners section. Yeah, we kept them separate from the regular Wehrmacht guys. These were the real nasty ones, the true believers. As I walked past their barracks, I heard hushed voices. Now that wasn't unusual in itself, but something about the tone made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I slowed my pace, trying to catch what they were saying without looking suspicious. My heart was pounding so loud I was afraid they'd hear it. That's when I caught a few words that made my blood run cold. Amerikaner, uniform, and Angriff. Now my German wasn't perfect, but I knew enough to understand American, uniform, and attack. Alarm bells started ringing in my head. I wanted to run and report it immediately, but I forced myself to keep walking calmly. If they suspected I'd overheard something, who knows what they might have done. As soon as I was out of sight, I practically sprinted to the command post. I burst in, probably looking like I'd seen a ghost. Captain Johnson was there, and he looked at me like I'd lost my mind. I started babbling about what I'd heard, tripping over my words in my rush to get it all out. "Slow down, Murphy," he said, his voice stern but steady. "Take a deep breath and start from the beginning." I did as he said, forcing myself to calm down. I explained everything, the hushed voices, the words I'd caught, and the sinking feeling in my gut that something terrible was about to happen. The captain's face grew more serious with each word. He didn't dismiss me or laugh it off like I'd half expected. Instead, he called in some of the higher-ups, and before I knew it, I was repeating my story to a room full of officers. They grilled me for hours, asking me to recall every detail, every inflection in the voices I'd heard. It was exhausting, and I started to doubt myself. What if I'd misheard? What if this was all a big misunderstanding? But then things started happening fast. More guards were posted. The SS prisoners were put under tighter surveillance. I saw men in suits I didn't recognize coming and going from the command post. It wasn't until a few days later that I found out what was really going on. Captain Johnson called me into his office. He looked tired, like he hadn't slept in days. "Murphy," he said, "what you overheard, it was big, bigger than we could have imagined." He explained that based on my report, they'd launched a full investigation. It turned out that a group of SS prisoners had been planning a massive escape and attack. They were going to somehow get their hands on American uniforms, break out, and then blend in with real American soldiers. From there, they planned to continue their partisan struggle, whatever the hell that meant. I felt sick to my stomach. If they had succeeded, I couldn't even imagine the chaos and bloodshed that would have followed. "You saved lives, son," Captain Johnson said, his voice gruff with emotion. "A lot of lives." I didn't feel like a hero. I felt scared, overwhelmed, and honestly, a little bit lucky. What if I hadn't been there at that exact moment? What if my German had been a little worse? The next few weeks were a blur. There were more interrogations, not of me this time, but of the prisoners. Security was tightened to levels I'd never seen before. The atmosphere in the camp was tense, like a rubber band stretched to its breaking point. I tried to go about my duties as normal, but I could feel eyes on me all the time. Some of the other guys had heard rumors about what happened, and they treated me differently. Some were in awe, others seemed almost resentful, like I'd upset the delicate balance we'd had. Then came the day I'll never forget. I was called to the command post again, but this time it wasn't just Captain Johnson waiting for me. There were several high-ranking officers there, including a general I'd only ever seen from a distance. They told me I was being awarded the Bronze Star. Me, just a kid from a small town who'd stumbled into this war, was getting a medal for heroism. I didn't feel heroic. I felt small and scared and overwhelmed. The ceremony was a blur. I remember the weight of the medal on my chest, the flash of cameras, the solemn faces of the officers. But mostly, I remember thinking about those SS prisoners. What would have happened if they'd succeeded? How many innocent people would have died? After that, things changed. I was moved to a different assignment, away from the POW camp. I think they were worried about retaliation. The war was over, but the danger wasn't. Not really. Years passed, and I tried to put it all behind me. I came back home, got married, had kids. But that day in the camp, those hushed German voices, they never really left me. Sometimes I'd wake up in a cold sweat, convinced I could hear them plotting again. I never talked about it much. How do you explain something like that to people who weren't there? How do you put into words the weight of knowing you might have changed the course of history, even in a small way? But now, all these years later, I'm finally sharing this story. I'm not looking for recognition or praise. I just want people to know that sometimes the smallest actions can have the biggest consequences, and that even in the darkest times, doing the right thing matters. I still have that Bronze Star tucked away in a drawer. My grandkids sometimes ask about it, and I tell them it's just an old piece of metal. But in my heart, I know it's so much more. It's a reminder that even in war, even among enemies, our humanity can shine through. And sometimes that's enough to change everything. It was a normal Tuesday afternoon, and Grandma was sitting in her beat-up Chevy in the parking lot of the local grocery store. She'd just finished picking up a few things for dinner and was about to head to her part-time job at the diner. The sun was beating down, and she remembered cranking up the AC as high as it would go. As she was getting ready to pull out of her parking spot, A sleek black sedan pulled up right next to her. The windows were tinted so dark she couldn't see inside. At first, she didn't think much of it, probably just someone looking for a spot. But then the driver's door opened, and a man in a crisp business suit stepped out. He looked like he'd just walked out of a board meeting or something. Grandma said he was tall, clean-shaven, with slicked back hair, the kind of guy who looked important and trustworthy. He approached her car with a friendly smile and motioned for her to roll down her window. She hesitated for a second. Her parents had always warned her about strangers, but he looked so professional and harmless that she did it anyway. "Excuse me, miss," he said, his voice smooth as silk. "I'm terribly sorry to bother you, but I was wondering if you could help me with something. It'll only take a moment." Grandma, always the polite one, nodded and asked what he needed. He pulled out a fancy-looking document and a pen. "You see, I'm in a bit of a bind. I need to get this bank document signed, but I've injured my writing hand." He held up his right hand, which was wrapped in a bandage she hadn't noticed before. "Would you mind signing it for me? It would really help me out." Now, Grandma was young and naive, but even she knew better than to sign some random document for a stranger. She started to politely decline, but the man cut her off. "Oh, I completely understand your hesitation," he said, his smile never wavering. "How about this? You don't have to sign your real name. Just scribble something that looks like a signature. The bank tellers don't actually check it that closely." For a split second, Grandma considered it. The man seemed so nice, and it would only take a moment. But then she glanced at the clock on her dashboard and realized she was going to be late for her shift if she didn't leave right away. "I'm so sorry," she said, "but I really have to go. I'm going to be late for work." She started to roll up her window, thinking that would be the end of it. But suddenly, the man's friendly demeanor changed. His smile disappeared, replaced by a cold, hard look that made her blood run cold. "I'm afraid I can't let you do that," he said, his voice now low and menacing. Before Grandma could react, the back door of the sedan flew open. Another man, this one bigger and burlier, lunged out and grabbed her arm through the open window. Grandma screamed and tried to pull away, but his grip was like iron. He started trying to drag her out of the car, while the man in the suit reached for her other arm. Time seemed to slow down. Grandma said she could hear her own heartbeat pounding in her ears. She was sure this was it. She was going to be kidnapped, or worse. But then, out of nowhere, there was a deafening bang. Everyone froze. Grandma looked over and saw Mr. Johnson, the owner of the hardware store across the street, standing in the doorway with a shotgun raised to the sky. "Let her go, or the next one won't be a warning shot," he bellowed. The two men didn't hesitate. They released Grandma and practically dove back into their car. The tires squealed as they peeled out of the parking lot and disappeared down the street. Grandma sat there, shaking like a leaf, as Mr. Johnson and a few other people who'd heard the commotion rushed over to check on her. Someone called the police, but by the time they arrived, the men in the black sedan were long gone. To this day, Grandma doesn't know what those men wanted with her. Were they really after a forged signature, or was that just a ruse to get her to let her guard down? She'll never know for sure. What she does know is how close she came to being taken that day. If she hadn't glanced at that clock, if she hadn't been running late for work, if Mr. Johnson hadn't been there with his shotgun, who knows what might have happened. It's been over 60 years since that day, but Grandma still gets nervous around black sedans. She made sure to drill into all of us grandkids the importance of being aware of our surroundings and trusting our instincts. I think about that day sometimes, about how different our family's story could have been if things had gone just a little differently. It's a chilling reminder of how quickly life can change and how important it is to stay vigilant. Grandma's always said she must have had a guardian angel looking out for her that day. Maybe she did, or maybe it was just dumb luck. Either way, I'm grateful every day that she made it out of that parking lot safely. It's crazy to think how one small decision, glancing at a clock, can alter the course of your entire life. Grandma's story has stuck with me all these years, a constant reminder that danger can appear when you least expect it, even on the most ordinary of days. I've asked her over the years if she ever reported it to the police or if they ever caught those guys. She said she gave a statement, but nothing ever came of it. The men in the black sedan just vanished into thin air, leaving behind nothing but a terrifying memory and a lifetime of what-ifs. Sometimes I wonder if those men are still out there somewhere, or if they ever succeeded in whatever sick plan they had that day. It's a chilling thought, but I try not to dwell on it too much. Instead, I focus on being grateful that Grandma made it out okay, and on passing along the lessons she learned to my own kids. Stay alert, trust your gut, and never underestimate the importance of being in the right place at the right time, or in Grandma's case, the importance of running late to work. It's a lesson I'll never forget, all because of one terrifying afternoon in a grocery store parking lot. I never thought I'd be sharing this, but I can't keep it bottled up anymore. My grandmother was always a mystery to me growing up. She had this distant look in her eyes, like she was haunted by something from her past. It wasn't until recently that I learned the dark truth about her life. It all started when I was helping clean out her attic after she passed away. As I was going through old boxes, I came across a dusty shoebox hidden in the corner. Inside were dozens of prescription pill bottles, all with different names on them. At first I was confused, but then I noticed something else, a collection of wigs carefully wrapped in tissue paper. My hands were shaking as I pieced it together. These weren't just random items. They were evidence of a secret life my grandmother had lived decades ago. I confronted my mom about it, and that's when the floodgates opened. She sat me down and told me the whole sordid story of my grandmother's dark past. Apparently, my grandmother had endured horrific abuse as a child. Her own father was a violent alcoholic who beat her regularly. She was married young to escape, but her husband died suddenly, leaving her a widow at just 22. The trauma and grief were too much to bear. In the 1950s, doctors freely prescribed mother's little helpers, barbiturates and other pills to help housewives cope. My grandmother quickly became dependent on them, but her tolerance grew, and soon her prescriptions weren't enough. That's when she hatched her scheme. She created multiple personas, complete with wigs and fake IDs, to visit different doctors and pharmacies. She'd invent ailments and sob stories to get prescriptions filled. Before long, she was juggling over a dozen fake identities to feed her addiction. I was stunned as my mom described how my sweet, church-going grandmother had lived this secret double life. She'd sneak out at night in disguise, doctor shopping all over town. The wigs allowed her to become someone else entirely. A grieving widow one day, a harried mother of 6 the next. Her addiction spiraled out of control. She started taking more and more risks to get her fix. One night, she accidentally crossed paths with a local pimp who tried to recruit her, thinking she was a prostitute in disguise. She barely escaped, terrified he would expose her. The close call shook her, but she couldn't stop. Her whole life revolved around maintaining her web of lies and feeding her insatiable craving for pills. She was constantly paranoid about being caught. Then came the night that changed everything. She was at a pharmacy trying to fill a fraudulent prescription when a police officer walked in. Panic set in as she realized her wig was slightly askew. The officer gave her a long, hard stare. Heart pounding, she quickly paid and hurried out to her car. As she fumbled with her keys, she saw the officer exit the pharmacy and start walking towards her. This was it. Her secret life was about to come crashing down. But just as he reached her car, his radio crackled to life. There was an emergency across town that required immediate backup. He gave her one last suspicious look before rushing to his patrol car and speeding away, sirens blaring. My grandmother sat there trembling for what felt like hours. She knew she'd come within inches of being arrested and having her whole charade exposed. It was the wake-up call she needed. That night, she flushed all her pills and burned her collection of wigs. She suffered through brutal withdrawals, but she was determined to get clean. It wasn't easy, but she slowly pieced her life back together. She never spoke about that period of her life again. She buried it deep and tried to move on. But the guilt and shame haunted her until the day she died. Finding those remnants in her attic brought it all rushing back. I'm still processing the fact that my grandmother, the woman who baked cookies and taught me to knit, had this whole secret history I never knew about. Part of me wishes I'd never found out, but mostly I just feel sad for her. The trauma and pain she endured, the desperation that drove her to such extremes. I can't condone what she did, but I understand it came from a place of deep suffering. I'm sharing this now because I think it's important to talk about the dark chapters in our family histories. Addiction and trauma leave lasting scars that echo through generations. My grandmother's story is a stark reminder of how easy it is to lose yourself to addiction and how hard the road to recovery can be. I'll never look at old family photos the same way again. Behind my grandmother's smile, I now see the pain she carried. I wish I could go back and tell her that she didn't have to suffer alone, that she was loved despite her flaws and mistakes. But all I can do now is learn from her story and try to break the cycle of trauma in my own life. If you're struggling with addiction or pain from your past, please reach out for help. Don't let it consume you like it did my grandmother. There's always hope for healing and redemption, no matter how dark things seem. I'm still grappling with this revelation about my family history. Some days I want to tell everyone, to lift the veil of secrecy. Other days I want to pack it all away and pretend I never found out. But I know that healing comes through honesty and openness. So I'm sharing it here, anonymously. Maybe it will help someone else feel less alone in their family's struggles. Maybe it will encourage someone to seek help before they go down a similar path of desperation and deceit. All I know is that I'll never look at a wig the same way again. To most people, they're just a fashion accessory. But to me, they'll always be a reminder of how addiction can make us unrecognizable, even to ourselves. Hiked deep into the backcountry, far from any trails or campgrounds. As the sun began to set, we found a small clearing to set up camp. There was a fire ban in effect due to drought conditions, so we couldn't have a campfire. I remember feeling a bit uneasy about that. The warm glow and crackling of a fire always made me feel safer in the woods at night. But we made do, cooking a simple meal on our camp stove before settling in for the night. As darkness fell, an eerie quiet descended on the forest. The usual nighttime sounds of crickets and frogs were strangely absent. It put me on edge, but I tried to brush it off as just typical jitters from being in an unfamiliar place. Grandpa and I chatted for a while as we lay in our sleeping bags, but eventually fell into silence as sleep began to take hold. I'm not sure how long I'd been dozing when I was jolted awake by a noise. At first, I thought I'd dreamed it, but then I heard it again, a rustling sound coming from the trees near our tent. My heart started to race as I strained my ears, trying to identify what could be making that sound. It was too loud to be a small animal, but didn't sound like a bear either. I whispered to Grandpa, asking if he heard it too. He nodded, his face tense in the dim light of our lantern. We sat frozen, barely daring to breathe as we listened. The rustling grew louder, punctuated by the snap of branches. Whatever it was big, and it was getting closer. Panic started to set in as my mind raced through all the possibilities. Bear, wolf, Sasquatch. I knew the last one was ridiculous, but in that moment of terror, my imagination ran wild. Grandpa must have sensed my rising fear because he squeezed my shoulder reassuringly. "We need to see what it is," he whispered. "Get the flashlight ready." With trembling hands, I grabbed our powerful LED flashlight. Grandpa slowly unzipped the tent, and we peered out into the inky blackness. The rustling had stopped, but I could sense something out there watching us. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. "On 3, Grandpa breathed. 1, 2, 3. I clicked on the flashlight, sweeping its beam across the trees. For a split second, I saw nothing. Then a blur of movement caught my eye, and I swung the light back. What I saw next will be seared into my memory forever. A massive shape came hurtling out of the tree above us, landing with a heavy thud just feet from where we sat. In the flashlight's glare, I caught a glimpse of tawny fur, muscled limbs, and gleaming yellow eyes. A mountain lion, and not just any mountain lion. This thing was enormous. I'd guess it weighed close to 200 pounds. Time seemed to stand still as we locked eyes. I was paralyzed with fear, unable to move or even breathe. Then, in a flash, it was gone. The big cat sprinted off into the darkness, its long tail disappearing into the underbrush. The whole encounter lasted only seconds, but it felt like an eternity. As soon as it vanished, the spell was broken. Grandpa and I exploded into action, scrambling out of the tent in a panic. We didn't even speak. We just started grabbing our gear and shoving it haphazardly into our packs. Every rustle of leaves made me flinch, convinced the mountain lion was about to pounce. "We need to get out of here," Grandpa said urgently. "That cat could still be nearby." I nodded mutely, too terrified to form words. We shouldered our hastily packed bags and clicked on our headlamps. The forest that had seemed so peaceful earlier now felt menacing, full of shadows where predators could be lurking. We set off at a brisk pace, constantly swinging our lights around to check for glowing eyes or movement in the trees. Every snapping twig or flutter of wings sent a jolt of adrenaline through me. I kept imagining I could hear the soft pad of paws stalking us. After about an hour of hiking, we finally allowed ourselves to slow down and catch our breath. My legs were shaking from exertion and leftover fear. We found a small rocky outcropping that offered some protection and decided to wait there until dawn. Neither of us slept a wink. We sat back to back, scanning the forest around us. I jumped at every little sound, convinced the mountain lion was about to appear. As the sky began to lighten, my fear slowly gave way to exhaustion and disbelief at what had happened. When the sun finally rose, we made our way back to the trailhead as quickly as possible. It wasn't until we were in the car heading home that the full impact of our close call really hit me. We could have easily been attacked or killed. The thought made me feel sick. In the weeks since, I've done a lot of research on mountain lion encounters. Apparently, it's incredibly rare for them to drop out of trees like that. Most experts I've talked to think it may have been stalking us and lost its footing, or perhaps was startled by our flashlight. Whatever the reason, we were extremely lucky to walk away unscathed. I still love the outdoors, but that night changed something in me. I'm much more cautious now, always hyper-aware of my surroundings. Sometimes I still wake up in a cold sweat, imagining those glowing eyes emerging from the darkness. I know the odds of having another encounter like that are slim, but the memory of that massive cat launching itself from the tree will stay with me forever. If you ever find yourself camping in mountain lion country, stay alert and be prepared. We were fortunate, but things could have ended very differently. Nature is beautiful, but it can also be terrifying. That's a lesson I won't soon forget. I still remember that day like it was yesterday, even though it's been over 20 years now. I was just 8 years old at the time, spending the summer with my grandpa like I did every year. He was a retired police officer, and I always felt safe with him. That day, we were driving back from getting ice cream in town. It was a hot July afternoon, and I was happily licking my chocolate cone in the back seat, not a care in the world. We were about halfway home when I noticed Grandpa kept glancing in the rearview mirror. His brow was furrowed, and he had that look he'd get sometimes, the one that meant something wasn't right. I didn't think much of it at first, figuring he was just being extra cautious like usual. But then, without warning, he suddenly swerved onto a side road and came to an abrupt stop. "Get down on the floor, Jimmy," he said in a low, urgent voice. "Now, and stay quiet." My heart started racing. I'd never heard Grandpa use that tone before. I quickly slid off the seat onto the floor, my melting ice cream forgotten. Through the gap under the front seat, I could see Grandpa reach into the glove compartment and pull out his pistol. My mouth went dry. In all the summers I'd spent with him, I'd never once seen him take out that gun. I heard another car pull up behind us, gravel crunching under its tires as it stopped. A car door opened and slammed shut. Heavy footsteps approached our car. "Stay down," Grandpa whispered. Then he got out to confront whoever was there. I was shaking, straining my ears to hear what was happening. There were muffled voices, Grandpa's familiar gruff tone, and another man's that I didn't recognize. They were talking quietly at first, then the voices got louder and angrier. I couldn't make out most of the words, but I caught phrases like, "You ruined everything," and "They're all dead because of you." Suddenly there was a scuffle, the sound of bodies slamming against our car, making it rock slightly. My breath caught in my throat. I wanted to peek out the window so badly to see what was happening, but I was too terrified to move. There was a grunt of pain. Was it Grandpa? And then the unmistakable sound of a gun being cocked. My whole body went cold. "You really want to do this, Frank?" I heard Grandpa say, his voice steady despite everything. "In broad daylight, with my grandson in the car?" My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. There was a long, agonizing silence. Then I heard the other man spit and mutter something I couldn't quite catch. Footsteps retreated, a car door slammed, and tires squealed as the other vehicle peeled away. I stayed frozen on the floor, barely daring to breathe. After what felt like an eternity, Grandpa got back in the car. "It's okay, Jimmy," he said softly. "You can come up now. It's over." I scrambled back onto the seat, my legs shaky. Grandpa's face was pale, and there was a trickle of blood at the corner of his mouth. "Are you okay?" I asked, my voice small and scared. He managed a small smile. "I'm fine, kiddo. Just a little scuffle, nothing to worry about." But I could tell by the way his hands were trembling slightly on the steering wheel that it had been much more than that. We drove home in silence. I had so many questions, but I was too shaken up to ask them. When we got to Grandpa's house, he made me wait in the car while he went inside to check on something. He came back out a few minutes later, looking even more grim. It wasn't until later that evening, after Grandma had gone to bed, that Grandpa finally told me what had happened. He sat me down at the kitchen table, his face more serious than I'd ever seen it. "Jimmy," he began, "what happened today, well, it's complicated, but you're old enough to know the truth." He took a deep breath. "That man who stopped us, his name is Frank Donovan. He's a very bad man who I helped put in prison a long time ago." My eyes widened. "Like a real criminal?" Grandpa nodded. "He was part of a drug trafficking ring. My team and I broke it up, arrested a lot of people. Frank went to prison for 10 years. He just got out a few months ago." I felt a chill run down my spine. "And he was looking for you? To hurt you?" "It seems that way," Grandpa said quietly. "He blamed me for ruining his life, for his friends dying in prison. He wanted revenge." I swallowed hard. "But how did he know where to find us?" Grandpa's face darkened. "That's the scary part, Jimmy. When I went inside earlier, I found something disturbing." He pulled out a manila envelope and dumped its contents onto the table. My jaw dropped. There were dozens of photos of our house, of Grandpa and Grandma in their yard, of me playing in the driveway. "He's been watching us," Grandpa said, his voice tight with anger. "Planning God knows what. If I hadn't noticed him following us today—" He trailed off, but I could fill in the blanks. My mind was reeling. All this time, this dangerous man had been lurking, taking pictures, waiting for his chance, and I'd had no idea. "What do we do now?" I asked, my voice shaky. Grandpa reached across the table and squeezed my hand. "We'll be okay. I've already called some of my old buddies on the force. They're keeping an eye out for Frank, and we're going to have extra patrols around the neighborhood. And tomorrow, we're going to install some new security measures around the house." I nodded, trying to feel reassured. But that night, as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, every little noise made me jump. I kept imagining Frank's face at my window, even though I'd never actually seen him. It was a long time before I finally fell into a restless sleep. The next few weeks were tense. Grandpa installed new locks, an alarm system, and security cameras. He taught me what to do if I ever felt like I was being followed, or if a stranger approached me. I wasn't allowed to play outside alone anymore. But as the summer wore on and nothing happened, we slowly began to relax. Maybe Frank had given up, scared off by Grandpa's warning. By the time I went home at the end of August, life had mostly returned to normal. It wasn't until years later, when I was in college, that I learned the full story. Frank had indeed been planning to kidnap me that day as revenge against Grandpa. He'd been stalking us for weeks, learning our routines. If Grandpa hadn't spotted him following us and confronted him, who knows what might have happened. The police never did catch Frank. He disappeared after that day and was never seen again. Sometimes I wonder if he's still out there somewhere, holding on to his grudge. But mostly, I'm just grateful for my grandpa's quick thinking and bravery. He quite literally saved my life that day. Even now, all these years later, I still get a little uneasy when I notice a car following me for too long. and I always check my rearview mirror. I still remember that day like it was yesterday, even though it's been over 20 years now. I was only 6 years old at the time, but some memories just stick with you, you know? Especially the ones that make you realize how close you came to never making it past childhood. It was a Friday afternoon, and I was playing with my toys in the living room while my mom was in the kitchen making dinner. The phone rang, and I heard my mom answer it. At first, her voice was cheerful, but then it quickly changed to a more serious tone. I couldn't make out exactly what she was saying, but I remember hearing my grandma's name mentioned a few times. After a few minutes, my mom's voice got louder and angrier. "No, Mom, I already told you. He's not coming over this weekend. We have plans," she said firmly. There was a pause, and then she continued. "I don't care if you've been planning this for weeks. The answer is still no." I stopped playing and listened more closely, wondering what was going on. My grandma and I were pretty close, or so I thought at the time, and I usually enjoyed spending weekends at her house. She'd bake cookies, let me stay up late watching cartoons, and tell me stories about when my mom was little. So I was confused about why my mom seemed so adamant about not letting me go. The call ended abruptly with my mom slamming down the receiver. She came into the living room looking flustered and upset. When she saw me watching her with wide eyes, she forced a smile and said everything was fine, just a little disagreement with Grandma. But I could tell something wasn't right. That night, I overheard my parents talking in hushed voices after they thought I was asleep. My mom was saying how angry and unhinged my grandma had sounded on the phone, how she'd been acting erratic lately and making weird comments. My dad tried to reassure her, saying it was probably just the stress of getting older and living alone. But my mom didn't seem convinced. The next morning, everything seemed back to normal. We went about our weekend as usual, errands on Saturday, church on Sunday. I mostly forgot about the phone call and my mom's concerns. Little did I know how significant that seemingly minor incident would turn out to be. It was about 2 weeks later when we got the news. My grandma had been found dead in her home, apparently from an accidental overdose of her pain medication. I was devastated and confused. How could this have happened? She had always been so careful with her pills. The funeral was a somber affair. I remember clinging to my mom's hand as we stood by the casket, looking down at my grandma's unnaturally still face. It didn't seem real. How could someone just be gone like that? In the days that followed, my mom spent a lot of time at my grandma's house, sorting through her belongings and taking care of the estate. One evening, she came home looking pale and shaken. She and my dad went into their bedroom and shut the door. Of course, being a nosy kid, I crept up to listen. What I heard chilled me to the bone. My mom was crying, her voice trembling as she spoke. "I found her diary," she said. "Oh God, I can't believe it. She was planning to poison him, John, our little boy. She wrote about it like she was doing us a favor." I heard my dad gasp. "What? That can't be right. Are you sure?" "It's all there in black and white," my mom replied, her voice rising with anger and disbelief. "She wrote about how he was a burden, how we'd be better off without him. She had it all planned out for that weekend she wanted him to visit. If I had let him go..." Her voice broke off into sobs. I stood there, frozen, unable to process what I was hearing. My grandma, who I thought loved me, had been planning to kill me. It didn't make sense. How could someone who baked me cookies and tucked me in at night want me dead? I must have made a noise, because suddenly the bedroom door opened and my parents were there, looking at me with a mixture of horror and concern. My mom quickly wiped her eyes and tried to smile, but I could see the pain and fear behind it. "Sweetie, how long have you been standing there?" she asked gently. I couldn't speak. I just stood there, lip quivering, as the tears started to fall. My dad scooped me up in his arms and carried me to the couch, where they both sat with me and tried to explain in terms a 6-year-old could understand. They told me that Grandma had been very sick in her mind, that sometimes people's brains can make them think and do terrible things. They assured me over and over that I was safe, that they would always protect me. But how do you make a child feel secure again after learning something like that? The next few months were a blur of therapy sessions and nightmares. I became terrified of any food or drink I hadn't seen my parents prepare themselves. I would wake up screaming, convinced that my grandma's ghost was in my room, trying to finish what she'd started. As I got older, I learned more details about what had happened. Apparently, my grandma had been struggling with mental health issues for years, but had hidden it well from the family. The diary my mom found revealed a descent into paranoid delusions and dark thoughts. She had convinced herself that I was some kind of changeling or demon child, and that by killing me, she would be saving my parents and the world from some terrible fate. It was all the ramblings of a sick mind, but that didn't make it any less terrifying to read. The worst part was realizing how close I had come to death without even knowing it. If my mom hadn't stood her ground that day, if she had given in and let me go for that weekend visit, I likely wouldn't be here today. It's a chilling thought that still gives me goosebumps. Even now, as an adult, I sometimes find myself looking at old family photos and wondering, in the pictures where my grandma is holding me as a baby or toddler, smiling at the camera, was she already having those thoughts? Was there always that darkness lurking behind her eyes, or did it come on suddenly in those final months? I'll never know for sure what caused my grandma's mental break, or why she fixated on me as the target of her delusions. Part of me is still angry at her for betraying the trust of a child who loved her unconditionally. But mostly, I just feel sad for the woman she once was, before illness twisted her mind into something unrecognizable. This experience has definitely shaped who I am as a person. I'm more cautious, more aware of the fragility of life and the unpredictability of human nature. But it's also made me incredibly grateful for the love and protection of my parents. Their quick thinking and strong instincts quite literally saved my life. I don't talk about this often. It's not exactly light dinner conversation, you know. But sometimes I think it's important to share these stories, if only to remind people to trust their gut instincts when something feels off. My mom's intuition that day was the only thing standing between me and tragedy. So if you're reading this and something in your life doesn't feel right, even if you can't put your finger on why, listen to that little voice. It might just save you or someone you love. Because the sad truth is, sometimes the monsters aren't hiding under the bed or in the closet. Sometimes they're the ones tucking you in at night, and you never even know until it's almost too late. It all happened during the Great Depression, long before I was born. My grandmother had lost everything, her job, her savings, even her hope. As the days dragged on with no end in sight, her mind started to slip away bit by bit. My dad was just a baby at the time, barely a year old. They were living in a tiny, run-down apartment, struggling to make ends meet. My grandfather worked whatever odd jobs he could find, often gone for days at a time. My grandmother was left alone with the baby, sinking deeper into despair. One day, Something in her finally snapped. My dad told me he pieced the story together from things his father said over the years. Apparently, my grandmother got it into her head that ending my dad's life would be a mercy, sparing him from the suffering and hardship that seemed endless. In her warped state of mind, she convinced herself it was the right thing to do. She went to the bathroom and found a bottle of nail polish remover. With shaking hands, she poured some into my dad's bottle, mixing it with what little milk they had. My stomach turns just thinking about it. This woman I never met, driven to such a desperate act against her own child. By some miracle, my grandfather came home early that day. He walked in just as my grandmother was about to give my dad the poisoned bottle. He said he'll never forget the vacant look in her eyes, like she wasn't really there. Without a word, he snatched the bottle away and poured it out. Then he gathered up my dad and left. He couldn't bring himself to call the police on his wife, but he knew he had to get the baby away from her. They stayed with a relative for a while after that. My grandmother was eventually hospitalized and got the help she needed, but things were never quite the same between her and my grandfather. How could they be after something like that? My dad says he has no memory of it, of course, but knowing how close he came to dying as a baby at the hands of his own mother, it shakes me to my core. I've always wondered if that trauma left some kind of mark on him, even if he can't remember it. I never met my grandmother. She passed away before I was born. But I've seen photos, and it's surreal to look at this smiling woman and know what she almost did. I try not to judge her too harshly. Those were desperate times, and her mind was broken by circumstances I can't even imagine. But still, it's hard to reconcile. Sometimes I wonder how different things would be if my grandfather hadn't come home when he did. I wouldn't exist, for one thing. My dad's whole life snuffed out before it really began. It's chilling to think about. I've struggled with whether to have kids of my own someday. Part of me worries that there's some genetic predisposition to mental illness in our family. What if I found myself in a similar dark place one day? The thought terrifies me. But then I think of my grandfather's love and quick action that saved my dad's life. I think of how my dad overcame his rough start and became a wonderful father to me. Maybe that's the real legacy I should focus on. I've never told anyone else this story. It feels almost taboo, like airing out dark family secrets. But keeping it bottled up inside has been eating away at me. I needed to share it, even anonymously like this. To anyone reading this who might be struggling with dark thoughts, please reach out for help. My grandmother's story could have ended so differently if she'd had support. No one should have to face that kind of despair alone. And to those who've had brushes with tragedy like my family did, you're not alone either. These kinds of stories are more common than we realize, I think. People just don't talk about them. But maybe we should, to remind each other of our shared humanity. I'm still processing all of this, to be honest. Some days it feels like a surreal dream. Surely this couldn't have really happened in my family. But then I look at old photos, at the sadness behind my grandfather's eyes, and I know it's all too real. I've thought about trying to find my grandmother's medical records to understand more about what she went through. But part of me is afraid of what I might learn. Maybe it's better not to know all the details. My dad doesn't like to talk about it much. I think it's painful for him, even though he has no direct memory of it. But he did tell me once that he doesn't hold any anger towards his mother. She was sick, he said, and she got better. That's what matters. I'm not sure I could be that forgiving in his shoes, but I admire his ability to move forward without bitterness. Maybe that's part of why he became such a compassionate person. He knows firsthand how fragile the human mind can be. Sometimes when I'm having a hard day, I think about how close my dad came to never experiencing life at all. It puts things in perspective. If he could survive that, surely I can handle whatever challenges come my way. I hope that by sharing this story, it might help someone else feel less alone in their family struggles. We all have shadows in our past. It's how we choose to face them and move forward that defines us. To my grandmother, wherever you are now, I hope you found peace. And to my grandfather, thank you for being there that day. Your love and quick thinking gave us all a chance at life. I'll never forget that. It all started on what seemed like a normal Tuesday. I was at work, mindlessly scrolling through my phone during my lunch break, when I got a call from my mom. Her voice was shaky and urgent. "Honey, you need to come home right away. There's been an incident with your grandparents." My heart dropped. A million scenarios raced through my mind. Had there been an accident? Were they sick? I rushed out of the office, barely remembering to tell my boss I had a family emergency. The whole drive home, I was a nervous wreck. When I got to my parents' house, the police were already there. My mom was sitting at the kitchen table, her face pale and drawn. My dad was pacing back and forth, running his hands through his hair. "What's going on?" I demanded. "Are Grandma and Grandpa okay?" My mom looked up at me with red-rimmed eyes. "Your grandfather's been arrested," she said softly. I felt like I'd been punched in the gut. "Arrested? For what?" She took a deep breath. For killing your great-grandmother." I stared at her in disbelief. This had to be some kind of sick joke. My sweet, gentle grandfather who always snuck me extra cookies and told the corniest dad jokes. A killer. It didn't make any sense. But as the day wore on and more details emerged, the horrifying truth sank in. My 95-year-old great-grandmother had been bedridden and suffering from advanced dementia. Apparently, my grandfather had gone to visit her at the nursing home and suffocated her with a pillow. I felt numb as I listened to my parents recount what the police had told them. How my grandfather had confessed immediately, saying he couldn't bear to see her suffer anymore. How he'd calmly waited for the nurses to find him there. But that wasn't even the worst of it. As we sat there in shocked silence, my mom dropped another bombshell. "There's something else you should know," she said quietly, "about your grandmother." I braced myself, not sure I could handle any more revelations, but nothing could have prepared me for what came next. Before she married your grandfather, she killed her first husband. For a moment, I was sure I'd misheard, but the grim looks on my parents' faces confirmed it. My grandmother, the woman who'd baked me birthday cakes and taught me to knit, was also a killer. Apparently, it had happened decades ago when she was just a young mother. Her first husband was an abusive alcoholic who regularly beat her and the kids. One night, he came home in a drunken rage, threatening to kill them all. In desperation, my grandmother had grabbed a kitchen knife and stabbed him. It was ruled self-defense and she was never charged. But the trauma of that night had haunted her for years. She'd kept it a closely guarded secret, never even telling my grandfather until they'd been married for over a decade. I sat there in stunned silence, trying to process it all. The grandparents I thought I knew so well suddenly felt like strangers. How could they have been carrying these dark secrets all these years? How many family dinners and holiday gatherings had we shared, never knowing the weight of what they'd done? The next few weeks passed in a blur of police interviews, lawyer consultations, and agonizing conversations with extended family. I took time off work, unable to focus on anything but the mess our family had become. Visiting my grandfather in jail was one of the hardest things I've ever done. Seeing him in that orange jumpsuit, his eyes hollow and haunted, broke my heart. He kept apologizing over and over, saying he'd only wanted to end her suffering. I didn't know whether to hug him or scream at him. My grandmother was a wreck. The stress of everything seemed to have aged her overnight. She alternated between weeping uncontrollably and sitting in numb silence. When I asked her about her first husband, she shut down completely. It was clear those wounds were still raw, even after all these years. As the legal proceedings dragged on, more disturbing details came to light. Apparently, my grandfather had been planning my great-grandmother's death for weeks. He'd researched methods, waited for a time when the nursing home would be understaffed. The premeditation made it all the more chilling. And yet, a small part of me understood his twisted logic. I'd seen how much it pained him to visit her, how she no longer recognized any of us. Was it mercy or murder? The line seemed blurrier than I'd ever thought possible. As for my grandmother, I found myself wondering about all the little things I'd never questioned before. The way she flinched at loud noises, how she always insisted on having multiple locks on all the doors, the sadness that sometimes crept into her eyes for no apparent reason. It all made a horrible kind of sense now. Months have passed, and I'm still struggling to come to terms with it all. My grandfather pled guilty to second-degree murder and is serving a 15-year sentence. My grandmother is in therapy, finally confronting the trauma she'd buried for so long. The rest of us are left to pick up the pieces of our shattered family. Every photo album, every cherished memory feels tainted now. I find myself questioning everything I thought I knew about my grandparents, about my own history. Some days, I'm overwhelmed with anger at the lies and secrets. Other days, I'm consumed by grief for the family we used to be. And sometimes, in my darkest moments, I wonder if there's some genetic predisposition to violence lurking in my own DNA. I don't know how we move forward from here. Can you ever truly forgive something like this? Can a family recover from such a profound betrayal of trust? All I know is that nothing will ever be the same. The grandparents I thought I knew are gone, replaced by strangers with blood on their hands. And I'm left to grapple with the knowledge that the people I loved most in this world were capable of taking a life. I'm sorry if this story is disjointed or doesn't make much sense. I'm still trying to process it all myself. I guess I just needed to get it out somehow, to try and make sense of the senseless. If nothing else, maybe it's a reminder that we never truly know the secrets people carry, even those closest to us. Growing up, I always knew there was something off about my grandparents. They were loving, sure, but there was this undercurrent of fear and paranoia that seemed to follow them everywhere. It wasn't until I was older that I learned the truth about their past and the horrifying ordeal they went through. It all came to light one summer evening when I was visiting them. I was 17 at the time, and my grandmother had been acting strange all day, jumpy and on edge. As we sat on their back porch watching the sunset, she suddenly broke down in tears. My grandfather held her hand tightly as she began to tell me their story. For over a decade, my grandparents had been trapped in what can only be described as a cult. They called themselves the Church of Eternal Light, but there was nothing light or holy about what went on there. My grandparents had joined when they were young and vulnerable, lured in by promises of community and spiritual enlightenment, but it quickly turned sinister. The leader, a charismatic man named Brother Elijah, exerted total control over his followers. He demanded complete obedience and huge financial contributions. My grandparents were forced to hand over most of their income each month, leaving them struggling to make ends meet. But if they missed a payment, there were consequences. My grandmother's voice shook as she described the correction sessions, brutal physical and psychological torture disguised as spiritual cleansing. Members who stepped out of line were beaten, starved, and subjected to sleep deprivation. My grandfather still had scars on his back from the whippings he endured, but the worst part was that they couldn't leave. Anyone who tried to escape was hunted down and dragged back to face severe punishment. The cult had eyes and ears everywhere. My grandparents lived in constant fear, never knowing who they could trust. As my grandmother spoke, I felt sick to my stomach. How could this have happened to them? How had they endured it for so long? But there was more to the story. A few years before I was born, my grandparents finally reached their breaking point. They couldn't take it anymore and decided to risk everything to escape. They spent months secretly planning, squirreling away small amounts of money and supplies whenever they could. Then one night, they made their move. My grandmother's eyes were wide as she recounted how they crept out of their house at 2 a.m., carrying only a few hastily packed bags. They left behind almost everything they owned: furniture, clothes, photos, mementos. All of it had to be abandoned. They drove for hours in tense silence, constantly checking the rearview mirror for headlights following them. Every passing car made them flinch. They were terrified that at any moment, cult members would appear to drag them back. But somehow, they made it. They drove clear across the country and settled in a small town where no one knew them. They changed their names, got new jobs, and tried to rebuild their lives. But the fear never fully went away. Even now, decades later, they still looked over their shoulders. They jumped at unexpected noises and were wary of strangers. The trauma ran deep. As my grandmother finished her story, I sat in stunned silence. I had so many questions, but I couldn't find the words. How had they kept this secret for so long? How many other families had similar stories? That night changed everything for me. Suddenly, so many things about my grandparents made sense. Their mistrust of organized religion, their frugal lifestyle, the way they'd get nervous in crowds. It was all a product of their ordeal. In the days and weeks that followed, I struggled to process what I'd learned. I felt angry at the cult for what they'd done, and guilty that I'd never known what my grandparents had been through. But mostly, I felt an overwhelming sense of admiration for their strength and resilience. They had survived unimaginable horrors and still managed to build a life filled with love. They'd protected our family from their dark past for as long as they could. Now that I knew the truth, I was determined to help them heal. We started seeing a therapist together, working through the lingering trauma. Slowly but surely, my grandparents began to open up more. They shared stories of their lives before the cult, of the dreams and aspirations that had been stolen from them. It was painful, but also cathartic. As the months passed, I noticed subtle changes. My grandmother smiled more easily. My grandfather's shoulders seemed less tense. They were finally starting to feel safe. But there were still moments when the past came rushing back. One day, we were at the grocery store when my grandmother suddenly froze. Her face went pale, and she started trembling. I followed her gaze and saw an older man examining a display of apples. He looked ordinary to me, but my grandmother was terrified. "It's him," she whispered. Brother Elijah's right-hand man. I tried to calm her down, assuring her it was just a coincidence. The man didn't even glance our way, but my grandmother was inconsolable. We had to leave immediately, abandoning our half-filled cart. Later, she admitted it probably wasn't really him. The rational part of her knew that. But in that moment, all the old fears had come flooding back. It was a stark reminder of how deeply the trauma was ingrained. Incidents like that became less frequent over time, but they never completely stopped. My grandparents would always carry the scars of their experience, but they were survivors, and they were determined to not let the cult control their lives any longer. As for me, learning their story changed my entire worldview. I became passionate about studying cults and helping other survivors. I wanted to understand how intelligent, caring people like my grandparents could get pulled into something so insidious, and I wanted to do whatever I could to prevent it from happening to others. Looking back now, I'm in awe of my grandparents' courage. They risked everything to break free and give our family a chance at a normal life. Their strength in the face of unimaginable adversity is truly inspiring. I know there are probably other families out there with similar stories, secrets buried deep, trauma passed down through generations. If you're reading this and it resonates with you, know that you're not alone. There is hope and healing possible, even after the darkest experiences. As for my grandparents, they're doing better these days. The nightmares are less frequent. The paranoia has eased. They're finally allowing themselves to truly live and enjoy their golden years. Watching them laugh and play with their great-grandchildren, you'd never guess the horrors they endured. But I'll never forget. Their story will always be a part of me, shaping how I see the world and reminding me of the resilience of the human spirit. I'm sharing it now in the hope that it might help others who are still trapped or struggling to heal. You can escape. You can rebuild. You are stronger than you know. We'd been on the road for days, winding our way through dusty pueblos and rugged mountain passes. Pop-Hop was in his element, feeling the freedom of the open road. Me, I was just along for the ride, soaking in the sights and sounds of rural Mexico. As the sun started to set, we rolled into a small town nestled in a valley. Pop-Hop spotted a quaint little posada on the outskirts and decided it looked like a good place to crash for the night. The building was old but well-maintained, with whitewashed walls and a red tile roof. Colorful bougainvillea spilled over the walls of the courtyard. An older man greeted us at the gate, introducing himself as the owner. He had a weathered face and piercing dark eyes that seemed to look right through you. There was something a bit off about him, but I couldn't put my finger on what exactly. He showed us to our room, a simple space with 2 narrow beds and a window overlooking the courtyard. After getting settled, we headed to the communal dining area for dinner. There were only a few other guests, a young Spanish couple on their honeymoon, a middle-aged American woman traveling solo, and an older Mexican gentleman who kept to himself. We all chatted over a hearty meal of enchiladas and beans. The Spanish woman, Maria, was vivacious and friendly. She had long, flowing dark hair that she kept tossing over her shoulder as she animatedly told stories about their travels. Her new husband gazed at her adoringly. As we finished eating, I noticed the posada owner hovering at the edge of the room, watching us intently. When I caught his eye, he quickly looked away and busied himself clearing plates. Something about his demeanor made me uneasy. We said goodnight and turned in early, tired from a long day on the road. I drifted off to sleep quickly, lulled by the chirping of crickets and the distant sound of a dog barking. Sometime in the dead of night, I was jolted awake by a blood-curdling scream. My heart racing, I sat bolt upright in bed. Pop-Hop was already on his feet, grabbing for the pocket knife he kept on the nightstand. "What the hell was that?" he muttered. Before I could answer, we heard the sound of running footsteps and doors slamming. Pop-Hop yanked open our door, and we peered out into the darkened hallway. Other guests were emerging from their rooms, looking scared and confused. The screaming was coming from the room where the Spanish couple was staying. Their door flew open, and Maria came stumbling out, sobbing hysterically. Her husband was right behind her, trying to calm her down. "Mi pelo," she wailed, clutching at her head. In the dim light, I could see that a large chunk of her long hair had been hacked off, leaving a ragged bald patch on one side of her scalp. The sight made my stomach lurch. "What happened? Did someone break in?" the American woman asked, her voice shaking. Maria's husband shook his head, looking bewildered. "I don't know. We were sleeping and then she just started screaming. I woke up and saw this." He gestured helplessly at his wife's mutilated hair. Pop-Hop pushed past us and checked their room, but found no sign of an intruder. All the windows were locked tight. By now the posada owner had appeared, looking rumpled and bleary-eyed. But as his gaze fell on Maria, a flicker of recognition, fear, passed over his face. It was gone in an instant, replaced by a mask of concern. "Oh dear, what a terrible thing," he said, not quite meeting anyone's eyes. "Let me get you some water, poor dear." He scurried off to the kitchen while the rest of us tried to comfort Maria. She had stopped screaming but was still crying softly, trembling all over. "How could this happen?" her husband demanded when the owner returned. "Is this place not secure?" The owner spread his hands in a gesture of helplessness. "I assure you, Signor, nothing like this has ever happened before. It must have been a very determined intruder." But something in his tone rang false. I caught Pop-Hop's eye and could tell he wasn't buying it either. "Well, I'm calling the police," the husband declared, pulling out his cell phone. A look of alarm crossed the owner's face. "Oh no, there's no need for that. The police station is very far. They will not come at this hour. Please, let me offer you a full refund and you can be on your way in the morning." Maria's husband hesitated, clearly torn. In the end, he relented, saying they just wanted to get out of there as soon as possible. None of us got much sleep for the rest of the night. We took turns keeping watch, jumping at every creak of the old building. I kept replaying the owner's odd reaction in my mind, convinced he knew more than he was letting on. As soon as the sun rose, we packed up and got ready to leave. Pop-Hop tried to press the owner for more information, but he remained evasive, ushering us out with forced cheerfulness. Just as we were about to ride off, I noticed an old woman watching us from an upstairs window. Her face was deeply lined with eyes like black pits. A chill ran down my spine as she slowly raised her hand, revealing a pair of rusty scissors. Then she vanished from view. I opened my mouth to say something to Pop-Hop, but the words died in my throat. What could I even say? He gunned the engine and we roared away from that God-forsaken place, the wind whipping away the last wisps of that nightmare. To this day, I still have no explanation for what happened in that posada. Was it some kind of bizarre local superstition? A deranged guest? Or something even darker? All I know is that I'll never forget the terror in Maria's eyes, or the way that old woman looked at me from the window. Sometimes late at night, I still wake up in a cold sweat, phantom scissors snipping at my hair in the darkness. Mexico may be beautiful, but it has its shadows too, and some mysteries are better left unsolved. It was September 1940, and my grandfather was working as a cinema projectionist in Lewisham, South London. The war had been raging for a year already, but nothing could have prepared him for what was to come. That fateful day started like any other. He arrived at the cinema early to prepare for the afternoon showing. As he was setting up the reels, the air raid sirens began to wail. At first, he didn't think much of it. False alarms weren't uncommon, and they'd gotten used to carrying on with their daily lives despite the constant threat. But then he heard it, the ominous drone of aircraft engines growing louder by the second. He rushed outside just in time to see a German bomber swooping low between the buildings on High Street, its dark silhouette unmistakable against the gray sky. Time seemed to stand still in that moment. My grandfather said he could see the pilot's face clearly as the plane roared past, so close he could almost reach out and touch it. Then came the whistling sound of bombs falling, followed by earth-shaking explosions that shattered windows up and down the street. The acrid smell of smoke and dust filled the air as people began screaming and running for cover. As the dust settled, my grandfather found himself volunteering as an air raid warden. His job was to patrol the streets during blackouts and sound the alarm if he spotted any incoming threats. Night after night, he'd climb to the roof of the cinema, straining his eyes and ears for any sign of danger. The Luftwaffe often sent over lone planes to drop incendiary devices, trying to start fires to guide the main bomber formations. One night in November, he spotted the telltale engine sound and flashing navigation lights of an incoming German aircraft. He immediately sounded the alarm, giving people precious minutes to take shelter before the bombs started falling. As he huddled in the cinema basement with others from the neighborhood, the ground shook violently with each impact. When they finally emerged hours later, much of High Street lay in ruins. But the worst was yet to come. In July 1944, my grandfather was on duty when he heard a strange buzzing sound growing louder. He looked up to see what appeared to be a small plane with no pilot, trailing flames behind it. It was a V-1 flying bomb, what they called doodlebugs. As he watched in horror, the engine suddenly cut out and the bomb plummeted towards the ground. He had just enough time to sound the alarm before diving for cover. The explosion was unlike anything he'd experienced before. When he regained consciousness, his ears were ringing and everything was coated in a layer of dust and debris. Stumbling out onto the street, he was met with a scene of utter devastation. The bomb had struck the market on Lewisham High Street, reducing it to rubble. What he saw next would haunt him for the rest of his life. Bodies and body parts were strewn everywhere. The air was filled with thick smoke and the agonized screams of the wounded. As he helped pull survivors from the wreckage, the full scale of the carnage became clear. 52 people lost their lives that day, with hundreds more injured. My grandfather worked tirelessly alongside other rescuers, digging through the rubble with his bare hands. He described finding a young mother still clutching her infant child, both of them crushed beneath a fallen wall. The image of their lifeless faces was seared into his memory. In the days that followed, he threw himself into his air warden duties with renewed determination. But the horrors he'd witnessed had taken their toll. He developed a deep-seated fear of sudden loud noises. The whistle of a tea kettle would send him into a panic, reminding him of the whistling bombs and the screams of the dying. Even decades later, long after the war had ended, certain sounds would trigger vivid flashbacks. The roar of a low-flying plane overhead, the wail of a distant siren. He'd wake up in a cold sweat, convinced he was back on that rooftop watching death rain down from the skies. My grandfather carried those psychological scars for the rest of his life. He'd never seek professional help. Men of his generation weren't supposed to show weakness. But I saw how it affected him, the way his hands would shake when recounting those experiences, the faraway look in his eyes. What struck me most was how matter-of-factly he spoke about it all. To him, it wasn't some grand, heroic tale. It was just the reality of what they lived through day after day. The constant fear, the uncertainty of whether you'd survive to see another sunrise. And yet they carried on. They rebuilt. They persevered. I often wonder how I would have coped in his shoes. The strength and resilience of that generation astounds me. They faced unimaginable horrors, yet somehow found the will to keep going, to not let the darkness consume them entirely. My grandfather passed away a few years ago, but his story has stayed with me. It's a stark reminder of the true cost of war, the toll it takes not just in lives lost, but in the trauma inflicted on survivors. As I write this, I can almost hear the drone of engines overhead, feel the ground shake beneath my feet. And I'm grateful that these are just echoes of the past, not my lived reality. To those who lived through the Blitz, who stood strong in the face of terror night after night, I have nothing but the deepest respect and admiration. Their courage and resilience in the darkest of times serve as an inspiration to us all. May we never forget their sacrifices, and may we strive to build a world where such horrors never happen again. I know this story might seem unbelievable to some. There are times I can hardly believe it myself, but I swear every word of it is true, as my grandfather told it to me. It's a piece of history that deserves to be remembered, a testament to the human spirit's capacity to endure even in the face of unimaginable adversity. Sometimes when I'm in London, I'll find myself walking down Lewisham High Street. It's hard to reconcile the bustling modern thoroughfare with the scenes of devastation my grandfather described. But if you look closely, you can still see a few old buildings bearing the scars of shrapnel damage, silent witnesses to the terror that once reigned from the skies. I often wonder about the lives that were lost that day in the market bombing. Who were they? What dreams and aspirations were cut short? And what of those who survived, who had to somehow pick up the pieces and carry on? Their stories, like my grandfather's, are a crucial part of our shared history. In sharing this, I hope to honor not just my grandfather's memory, but all those who lived through those harrowing times. Their experiences should never be forgotten. It's a reminder of the true cost of conflict and why we must always strive for peace, because no one should ever have to endure what they did. Pop-Hop wasn't your typical dad. He had this wild gray beard and long hair that he kept in a ponytail. Even in his 60s, he still wore leather jackets and rode that old bike everywhere. Growing up, I used to love hearing his stories about his travels through Canada, the US, Mexico, and Central America. He'd tell me about camping under the stars in the Rockies, drinking tequila with locals in tiny Mexican villages, and dodging drug runners in Guatemala. It all sounded so exciting and free. What I didn't know was that there was a darker side to Pop-Hop's adventures. I only found out about it last summer, and it still gives me chills thinking about it. It started when I went to visit Pop-Hop at his little cabin in northern British Columbia. He was getting on in years, and I wanted to spend some time with him, maybe help fix up the place a bit. When I got there, I could tell something was off. Pop-Hop seemed distracted and on edge. At first I figured it was just old age catching up to him. That night, as we sat on the porch drinking beers, Pop-Hop suddenly got real quiet. He had this faraway look in his eyes. Then he turned to me and said, "Son, There's something I need to tell you about. Something that happened to me years ago that I've never told anyone. I felt a chill run down my spine. Pop Hop had always been this larger-than-life character to me, full of wild stories and adventures, but I'd never seen him look so serious before. He took a long pull on his beer and started talking. It was back in '78. I was doing my usual gig as a motorcycle taxi, ferrying folks around remote parts of northern Alberta and BC in the fall. Good money, and it funded my winters down south. I nodded. I'd heard about his taxi work before. Anyway, I got a call one night to pick up a fare way out in the boonies, some mining camp about 100 miles from the nearest town. Normally, I wouldn't take a job that far out that late, but they were offering triple my usual rate. Said it was urgent. Pop Hop's voice got quieter. I should have known something was off, but I was young and stupid, and the money was too good to pass up. He described the long ride out into the wilderness, how the shadows seemed to grow deeper as he got further from civilization, the way the full moon cast an eerie glow over the landscape. I finally got to the coordinates they gave me around midnight. Place was deserted, just a few old trailers and mining equipment. No lights, no people. I was about to call it quits when this guy comes walking out of the shadows. Pop Hop's hands were shaking slightly as he lit a cigarette. He was tall, real tall, wearing this long black coat. But his face, I'll never forget it as long as I live. It wasn't quite human. The proportions were all wrong. And his eyes. He trailed off, staring into the darkness beyond the porch. I waited, hardly daring to breathe. His eyes were solid black, no whites at all, and they reflected the moonlight like an animal's. Pop Hop shuddered. I knew right then I'd made a big mistake coming out there. He went on to describe how the stranger had climbed onto the back of his bike without a word, how his body had felt unnaturally cold, pressed against Pop Hop's back, the way the man's long fingers had dug into his shoulders, the nails feeling more like claws. I took off like a bat out of hell, Pop Hop said. Didn't even ask where he wanted to go. I just knew I had to get away from that place. What happened next still haunts me. Pop Hop said they rode for what felt like hours through the dark forest. The whole time, he could feel the stranger's icy breath on the back of his neck. Occasionally, the man would lean in close and whisper things in a language Pop Hop didn't recognize. It was like no sound I've ever heard, he told me, his voice barely above a whisper now. Not quite words, more like chittering, made my skin crawl. Pop Hop said he started to lose track of time and direction. The trees all looked the same in the moonlight. He wasn't even sure they were on a road anymore. I started to feel like we were going in circles, or maybe spirals, like we were being drawn deeper and deeper into something. He shook his head. I know it sounds crazy, but I swear the forest itself seemed alive. The branches reached out for us as we passed. I could hear things moving in the underbrush. I wanted to tell Pop Hop to stop, that I didn't want to hear any more, but I couldn't find my voice. He described how his bike suddenly died, leaving them stranded in the middle of nowhere. The silence was absolute. No wind, no animals, nothing. I turned to ask the guy what the hell was going on, Pop Hop said, but he was gone, vanished. I was alone, or so he thought. Pop Hop said he then became aware of movement all around him, shapes flitting between the trees, eyes gleaming in the darkness, and that chittering sound, growing louder. I've never been so scared in my life, he admitted. I just knew that whatever was out there in those woods, it wasn't natural, wasn't of this world. Pop Hop said he closed his eyes and started praying. He wasn't even religious, but at that moment, he was willing to try anything. Next thing I knew, I heard my bike sputter to life. I didn't question it. I just gunned it and got the hell out of there as fast as I could. He rode until dawn, not stopping until he reached the nearest town. Pop-Hop said he was in a daze for days afterward. He couldn't explain what had happened or how he'd ended up so far off course. I tried to convince myself it was just exhaustion, that I'd gotten turned around in the dark and imagined the whole thing, he said. But deep down, I knew it was real. Pop-Hop fell silent then, staring off into the night. I didn't know what to say. Part of me wanted to dismiss it as the ramblings of an old man, but the fear in his eyes, I'd never seen anything like it. "Why are you telling me this now?" I finally asked. He turned to me, his face grave. "Because they're coming back, son. I can feel it. Whatever's out there in those woods, it's stirring again." I tried to reassure him, to tell him it was just his imagination. But as I was talking, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. Out in the darkness beyond the porch, just at the edge of the trees, I saw a pair of eyes reflecting the light from the cabin. Completely black eyes. They blinked once and then were gone. Pop-Hop and I sat in silence for the rest of the night, neither of us willing to go inside or take our eyes off the tree line. When dawn finally broke, I convinced him to come stay with me in the city for a while. He agreed, but I could tell he was reluctant to leave his bike behind. As we drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. I kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting to see a tall figure in a black coat standing in the middle of the road behind us. It's been months now, and Pop-Hop seems to have settled into city life okay. But sometimes I catch him staring off into the distance with that same haunted look in his eyes. And on quiet nights, when the wind is just right, I swear I can hear a faint chittering sound coming from the darkness beyond my window. I don't know what really happened to Pop-Hop all those years ago. Part of me still wants to believe it was just the product of an overactive imagination and too many long nights on the road. But another part, a part that grows stronger every day, knows that there are things in this world beyond our understanding, things that lurk in the shadows, waiting. And sometimes, on nights when I can't sleep, I find myself wondering, what if they're not content to stay in the woods anymore? What if they're spreading, searching? What if, someday, they come looking for me? I can't believe it's been over 50 years since that terrifying day, but the memory is still so vivid in my mind. I was just 17, naive and eager to make some extra money. Little did I know how close I came to ruining my life. It was a crisp autumn morning, and I was walking to the diner where I worked part-time as a waitress. As I approached the parking lot, I noticed a sleek black car idling near the entrance. A well-dressed man in his 40s stepped out and waved me over with a friendly smile. "Excuse me, miss," he called out. "I was wondering if you might be able to help me with something. It'll only take a moment." I hesitated, glancing at my watch. I still had about 20 minutes before my shift started, so I cautiously approached him. Up close, I could see his expensive suit and polished shoes. He looked important and trustworthy. "What can I help you with, sir?" I asked politely. He leaned in conspiratorially. "Well, you see, I'm in a bit of a predicament. My wife asked me to deposit this check for her, but she forgot to sign it." He pulled an envelope from his breast pocket. "I was hoping a kind young lady like yourself might be willing to sign it for me." I'd make it worth your while, of course. My heart started racing. I knew it was wrong, but the man seemed so nice and professional. Surely it couldn't be that big of a deal, right? I don't know, I stammered. That doesn't sound legal. He chuckled warmly. Oh, don't worry about that. It's just a formality. My wife and I share the account anyway. I do it myself, but the bank knows my handwriting too well. He winked. I'll give you $50 cash right now if you help me out. That's good money for just a few seconds of work. My mind was reeling. $50 was more than I made in a week at the diner. It seemed too good to be true. But a nagging voice in the back of my head kept warning me that something wasn't right. What exactly would I have to do? I asked hesitantly. The man's smile widened. He opened the car door and motioned for me to sit inside. Against my better judgment, I did. The leather seats were cool and smooth. It's simple, he explained, handing me the envelope and a pen. Just sign right here where it says account holder. Make it look feminine, a nice loopy signature. Then I'll take care of the rest. My hand was shaking as I took the pen. I stared at the blank line, heart pounding in my chest. This was my chance to walk away, to listen to that gnawing feeling in my gut. But the promise of easy money was so tempting. Just as I was about to lower the pen to the paper, I glanced at my watch again and gasped. Oh no, I'm going to be late for work, I exclaimed, suddenly snapping back to reality. The man's demeanor changed in an instant. His charming smile twisted into a snarl as he grabbed my wrist roughly. You're not going anywhere, he growled. Sign the damn check. Terror coursed through me as I realized the grave mistake I'd made. I yanked my arm away and scrambled for the door handle, but he was faster. He grabbed a fistful of my hair and slammed my head against the dashboard. Stars exploded in my vision as pain lanced through my skull. I screamed and clawed at his hands, desperately trying to break free. He was cursing and shouting, but the words were muffled by the ringing in my ears. Suddenly, there was a deafening bang. The man released me and I tumbled out of the car onto the pavement. Through blurry eyes, I saw a burly man in a security uniform standing there with a smoking gun pointed at the sky. Step away from the girl and put your hands where I can see them, the guard bellowed. The would-be kidnapper snarled but complied, slowly raising his hands. I scrambled backward on the ground, putting as much distance between us as I could. Everything after that was a blur of police sirens, paramedics, and concerned faces asking if I was all right. I learned later that the security guard worked at the bank across the street and had seen the whole thing unfold. If he hadn't been there, it turns out the man was part of a sophisticated fraud ring that had been targeting young women all over the state. They'd used the forged checks to drain bank accounts, often stealing tens of thousands of dollars before the victims even realized what had happened. I was lucky. So incredibly lucky. But that day haunted me for years. I had nightmares about what might have happened if I'd gotten in that car just a few minutes earlier. The guilt and shame of almost falling for the scam ate away at me. It took a long time, but eventually I was able to forgive my younger self for being so naive. I realized that predators like that man are experts at manipulation. They know exactly what to say to make you let your guard down. Now, decades later, I still get chills thinking about how close I came to ruining my life that day. I've shared this story with my children and grandchildren, hoping they'll learn from my mistake. Trust your instincts. If something feels wrong, it probably is. And no amount of money is worth compromising your safety or integrity. That autumn morning changed me forever. It was a harsh lesson, but one I'm grateful to have learned. I only wish I could go back and thank that security guard for saving me. His quick thinking not only rescued me from immediate danger, but likely spared countless other young women from falling victim to that criminal's scheme. Life is full of pivotal moments that shape who we become. For me, that terrifying encounter in a parking lot was one of them. It taught me to be more cautious, to value my safety above all else, and to listen to that little voice of doubt when something seems too good to be true. I often wonder what became of that man. Did he face justice for his crimes? Did he ever feel remorse for the lives he nearly destroyed? I'll never know. But I do know that I'm infinitely grateful for the twist of fate that kept me from becoming another one of his victims. So if you're reading this and you're young, please learn from my experience. Be wary of strangers bearing gifts or easy money. Trust your gut instincts. And never ever get into a car with someone you don't know, no matter how well-dressed or charming they may seem. The world can be a dangerous place, but it's also full of good people like that security guard who are willing to step up and do the right thing. I try to pay that kindness forward whenever I can, keeping an eye out for those who might be vulnerable to predators and scams. It's been over 50 years, but I still sometimes wake up in a cold sweat, reliving those terrifying moments in that black car. But then I remember how lucky I am to have escaped, to have lived a full and happy life despite that brush with danger. And I'm filled with gratitude for the second chance I was given that day. Stay safe out there, everyone. And remember, if something seems too good to be true, it probably is. I never thought I'd witness something so horrific in my life, let alone at my mundane job at the docks. It was just another ordinary Tuesday morning, or so I thought. The air was thick with the smell of salt and diesel as I made my way to work, nodding hello to the usual faces. Little did I know that in just a few hours, I'd be seeing things that would haunt me for the rest of my days. I'd been working at the docks for about 3 years by that point. It was hard work, but honest. I enjoyed the camaraderie with my co-workers and the satisfaction of a job well done at the end of each day. One of the guys I worked with regularly was an older fella we all called Crazy Owl. He was a bit of an odd duck, kept to himself mostly, and had this intense, haunted look in his eyes. But he was a damn hard worker and seemed harmless enough, so we all just accepted his quirks. I knew Owl was a veteran. He'd served in the Pacific during World War II. Sometimes after a few beers, he'd allude to being a prisoner of war, but he never went into details. You could tell those memories weighed on him heavily. There was a sadness about him, a darkness lurking just beneath the surface. But I never could have imagined the violence that darkness was capable of unleashing. That morning started like any other. We were unloading cargo from a Korean freighter that had come into port overnight. I remember thinking the ship looked a bit run down, with peeling paint and patches of rust. The Korean crew kept to themselves as we worked, which wasn't unusual. About 2 hours into our shift, I heard raised voices coming from the other side of a stack of shipping containers. At first I ignored it. Arguments weren't uncommon in our line of work, but then the shouting got louder, angrier. I heard the unmistakable sound of a scuffle breaking out. Curious, I made my way around the containers to see what was going on. What I saw when I rounded that corner is seared into my brain forever. Owl had one of the Korean sailors pinned against the side of a container. His face was contorted with rage, eyes wild and feral. Before I could even process what was happening, Owl pulled out a knife and plunged it into the sailor's chest. I froze in shock, unable to believe what I was seeing. The Korean man's eyes went wide with pain and fear. Blood blossomed across his shirt as he slumped to the ground. Owl yanked the knife out and stabbed him again and again, screaming incoherently the whole time. It was like he was in some kind of trance, consumed by blind hatred and fury. Finally, my paralysis broke and I started yelling for help. But it was too late for that poor sailor. By the time others started running over, he was already dead, his body a bloody mess on the dock. Owl whirled around, his eyes unfocused and crazed. He started ranting about goddamn Koreans and evil bastards. It was chilling to see someone I thought I knew transformed into this raging monster. He brandished his bloody knife, warning everyone to stay back. In all the chaos, I didn't even notice at first that another Korean crew member had rushed over to help his fallen comrade. Owl spotted him and let out an inhuman roar. Before anyone could stop him, he lunged at the man and slashed his throat. The sailor clutched at his neck, blood spurting between his fingers, before collapsing. At that point, complete pandemonium broke out. People were screaming and running in all directions. I heard someone shouting that they'd called the police. Owl was raving like a madman, waving his knife and threatening anyone who came near. His clothes and hands were covered in blood. I'll never forget the look in his eyes. It was like staring into the face of pure hatred and insanity. Whatever horrors he'd experienced during the war had clearly broken something inside him. In that moment, he wasn't the quiet, hard-working man I knew. He was a cornered animal lashing out at perceived enemies. The next few minutes were a blur. I remember hearing sirens in the distance, steadily getting louder. Someone tried to reason with Owl, but he was beyond reaching. He kept shouting about revenge and making them pay. It was surreal, like something out of a nightmare. Suddenly, there was a loud crack, and Owl stumbled backward. At first I thought someone had managed to hit him, but then I saw the growing red stain on his chest. One of the dock security guards had shot him. Owl looked almost confused as he sank to his knees. The knife slipped from his fingers and clattered to the ground. As the light faded from his eyes, I swear I saw a flicker of the old Owl, scared and sad and lost. Then he toppled over, dead. The police arrived moments later, but it was all over by then. 3 men lay dead on the blood-slicked concrete of the loading dock. The air rang with shouts and sobbing. I felt numb, like I was watching everything unfold from far away. The rest of that day passed in a haze as we were all questioned by the police. I recounted what I'd seen over and over, still struggling to believe it had actually happened. How could the man I'd worked alongside for years have snapped so violently? In the days and weeks that followed, more details came out about Owl's past. Turns out he'd been captured by the Japanese during the war and held in a POW camp. Some of the guards there were Korean collaborators who'd been particularly brutal. Owl had witnessed and experienced unspeakable things during his captivity. All those years of buried trauma and pain had finally erupted in one awful moment of violence. It didn't excuse what he'd done, but it helped explain how a seemingly ordinary man could commit such a horrific act. The whole incident left me shaken to my core. I had trouble sleeping for months afterward, plagued by nightmares of blood and screaming. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Owl's crazed face and the terror in those sailors' eyes. I kept wondering if there was something I could have done differently, some way I could have stopped it. But deep down, I knew it had all happened too fast. I ended up quitting my job at the docks not long after. I just couldn't bear to be in that place anymore, haunted by the ghosts of what I'd witnessed. Sometimes I still have flashbacks, especially when I'm near the water or hear Korean being spoken. That day showed me how much damage war can do to a person's psyche, how trauma can fester for years before exploding in violence. It opened my eyes to the darkness that can lurk inside even the most unassuming people. Most of all, it taught me how quickly and brutally life can change in an instant. I'll carry the weight of what I saw that day for the rest of my life. The senseless loss of life, the eruption of long-buried hatred, the split-second transformation of a co-worker into a killer. It's all seared into my memory. I hope that by sharing this story, I can help others understand the long-lasting impacts of war and the importance of addressing trauma before it turns to violence. Maybe then some small good can come from such a senseless tragedy. At first, they assigned me to a supply unit. I spent my days loading trucks, organizing inventory, and doing all the unglamorous work that keeps an army running. It wasn't exciting, but I told myself I was doing my part. That all changed one day when an officer pulled me aside and asked if I spoke German. Growing up, my Oma had insisted on teaching me her mother tongue, even though my parents discouraged it. I hesitated, not sure if admitting to speaking the enemy's language was a good idea, but something made me nod yes. The next thing I knew, I was being transferred to an intelligence unit. They told me I'd be working with POWs, translating conversations and gathering information. It sounded important, maybe even a bit exciting. I pictured myself as some kind of spy, uncovering crucial secrets that would help win the war. The reality was far different. When I arrived at the POW camp, the sight of the prisoners shocked me. These weren't the fierce Nazi warriors I'd imagined. Many were just boys, not much older than me. They looked tired, scared, and hungry. As I began my work, listening in on their conversations and translating documents, I started to see them as human beings rather than faceless enemies. One day stands out in my memory more than any other. It was a sweltering summer afternoon, and I was transcribing a conversation between two young German soldiers. They were talking about their homes, their families. One of them mentioned his little sister's upcoming birthday, wondering if she'd get the doll she wanted. It hit me like a punch to the gut. These were just normal guys, caught up in something much bigger than themselves. As I continued my work, I found myself growing increasingly uncomfortable. The lines between right and wrong, ally and enemy, began to blur. I overheard conversations that haunted me, stories of loss, fear, and regret. Some prisoners spoke of atrocities they'd witnessed or even participated in, their voices hollow with shame and trauma. Others clung to their beliefs, spouting propaganda they'd been fed since childhood. It was a messy, complicated reality that didn't fit neatly into the black and white narrative I'd been taught. One prisoner in particular caught my attention. His name was Hans, and he was about my age. He had a quick wit and a talent for sketching. We weren't supposed to fraternize with the prisoners, but sometimes I'd linger near his group, listening to his jokes and watching him draw. One day I saw him sketching a beautiful landscape, rolling hills, a little farmhouse, flowers in bloom. When he noticed me looking, he explained it was his home in Bavaria. The longing in his voice was painfully familiar. As the weeks went by, I found myself struggling more and more with my role. I was gathering information that could potentially save American lives, but at what cost? The weight of the secrets I carried felt suffocating. I started having nightmares, dreams where I was trapped in a room full of whispering voices, all speaking in a jumble of English and German. The breaking point came on a crisp autumn day. I was translating a letter from a prisoner to his wife back in Germany. As I read his words of love and longing, I realized with a jolt that he was describing the same little village in Bavaria that Hans had drawn. My hands started shaking as I continued reading. The man wrote about his neighbor's son, a young artist who had been drafted and sent to the front lines. He hadn't been heard from in months. I knew without a doubt that he was talking about Hans. The sketch, the jokes, the talent, it all made sense. And here I was, reading a letter that confirmed what Hans probably already knew deep down, that he would never see his home again. I don't remember much of what happened next. I know I finished my shift somehow, but my mind was in a fog. That night, I lay awake in my bunk, staring at the ceiling and trying to make sense of it all. How could I continue doing this job, knowing the real human cost behind every piece of information I gathered? The next morning, I went to my commanding officer and requested a transfer back to a supply unit. I made up some excuse about struggling with the language, not wanting to admit the real reason. To my surprise, he agreed without much fuss. Maybe he saw something in my eyes that told him I wasn't cut out for this kind of work. As I packed up my few belongings, I took one last look around the camp. I saw Hans in the distance, hunched over a piece of paper, probably working on another sketch. For a moment, I thought about going over to him, telling him about the letter, giving him some kind of closure. But what good would it do? It wouldn't change anything, wouldn't bring him home or end this awful war. So I turned away and left, carrying the weight of unspoken words and untold stories. The rest of my war was spent back in supply, loading trucks and counting inventory. It was mind-numbing work, but at least I could sleep at night. Years have passed since then, but I still think about that time often. About Hans, about the letter, about all the lives intersecting in ways we couldn't see or understand. Sometimes I wonder what happened to those prisoners after the war. Did any of them make it home? Did Hans ever see his Bavarian hills again? I never told anyone about my brief time in intelligence work. It felt like a strange dream, something that happened to someone else. But lately, as I've watched the world change and new conflicts arise, I find myself thinking about it more and more. About the complexity of war, the humanity of our so-called enemies, and the heavy burden of knowledge. I don't have any grand conclusions or life-changing insights to share. I'm just an old man now, looking back on a time that shaped me in ways I'm still trying to understand. But if there's one thing I've learned, it's that nothing in war is simple. Behind every uniform, every flag, every piece of intelligence, there's a human story. And sometimes, the most important thing we can do is listen to those stories, even when they make us uncomfortable. As I sit here writing this out, I can almost smell the musty air of that POW camp, hear the mix of languages floating on the breeze. It's a part of my past I've kept locked away for so long, but maybe it's time to let it out. Maybe by sharing this, I can help someone else understand the true cost of war, not just in lives lost or battles won, but in the countless small tragedies that never make it into the history books. I don't know if anyone will read this or care about an old soldier's ramblings, but it feels good to finally put it into words, to acknowledge that part of my life, to remember Hans and all the others whose stories I carried with me. In the end, maybe that's the best we can do. Remember, and hope that by doing so, we can create a world where such stories don't need to be repeated. Still remember that fateful day in May 1836. like it was yesterday. The sun had just started to peek over the horizon, casting a warm glow across our little fort in Texas. I was only 9 years old at the time, still groggy from sleep as I stumbled out of bed to help Ma with the morning chores. Little did I know that within hours, my entire world would be turned upside down. The attack came suddenly and without warning. One moment, everything was peaceful and quiet. The next, the air was filled with war cries and the thundering of hooves. I froze in terror as I saw them pouring over the walls, dozens of Comanche and Kiowa warriors, their faces painted for battle. Chaos erupted all around me. Men were shouting, women were screaming, children were crying. I saw my uncle fall, an arrow protruding from his chest. My cousin John was dragged from his horse and scalped before my eyes. I tried to run, to find my parents, but strong arms grabbed me from behind. I kicked and screamed as I was lifted onto a horse. The last thing I saw as we galloped away was our fort in flames, the air thick with smoke, and the cries of the dying. Those first days with the Comanche were a blur of terror and confusion. I didn't understand their language. Their customs were alien to me. I cried constantly for my mother, but she never came. Gradually, as the days turned to weeks and months, I began to adjust to my new life. An older woman named Nadua took me under her wing, teaching me their ways with patience and kindness. I learned to speak Comanche, to ride horses bareback, to tan hides and make pemmican. As the years passed, my memories of my old life began to fade. The Comanche became my family. Their ways became my ways. I took a Comanche name, Nadua, after the woman who had cared for me. When I was 15, I married a young warrior named Peta Nokona. He was kind and gentle with me, and I grew to love him deeply. We had 3 children together, 2 boys and a girl. My daughter, Prairie Flower, was the light of my life. Those were happy years, filled with love and laughter. I felt at peace, at home among the people. But fate had other plans for me. It was a cold December day in 1860. I was at our winter camp with Prairie Flower, grinding corn for the evening meal. Suddenly, shouts of alarm rang out. A group of Texas Rangers had found us. In the chaos that followed, I was separated from my husband and sons. A ranger grabbed me, and I fought with all my strength to get away. But it was no use. I was thrown over a horse and carried off. My daughter clutched tightly in my arms. I soon learned the horrible truth. These men believed they were rescuing me, returning me to my real family after 24 years. But the Comanche were my real family now. I begged and pleaded to be allowed to return to them, but my words fell on deaf ears. They took me to my uncle's home in East Texas. People kept telling me how lucky I was to be saved, but I felt only despair. Everything was strange and frightening. The clothes, the food, the customs. I couldn't understand their rapid English, and they couldn't understand my Comanche. Worst of all, they took my precious Prairie Flower away from me, sending her to live with distant relatives. My heart shattered into a million pieces. I tried to run away several times, desperate to return to my Comanche family, but I was always caught and brought back. Eventually they moved me to my sister's home, hoping I would adjust better there. But how could I adjust to this alien world? Everything I loved had been ripped away from me. My husband, my sons, my daughter, my entire way of life, gone in an instant. The years that followed were a haze of grief and despair. I never truly adapted to this new life. The food made me sick. The clothes felt restrictive and uncomfortable. I longed for the open plains, for the feel of a horse beneath me, for the sound of my children's laughter. When news came that my beloved Prairie Flower had died of influenza, something inside me broke. I stopped eating, stopped speaking. I would spend hours staring blankly at the walls, my mind far away on the prairies of my youth. Even now, decades later, I am haunted by what I've lost. In my dreams, I am still Nadua, running free across the grasslands with my Comanche family. I wake with tears on my cheeks, my heart aching for a world that no longer exists. They say they rescued me, but the truth is they destroyed me. I am a woman caught between two worlds, belonging fully to neither. My body may be here, but my spirit will always roam free with the Comanche. Sometimes I wonder what my life would have been like if I had never been rescued. Would I still be with my Comanche family, watching my grandchildren grow? Or would I have fallen victim to disease or warfare as so many did? There's no way to know now. All I can do is cling to the memories of those happy years with the people and pray that someday, in the next life perhaps, I will be reunited with those I loved and lost. For now, I remain a stranger in a familiar land, longing for a home I can never return to. The wound in my heart refuses to heal, a constant reminder of all that was taken from me. I often find myself staring at the horizon, imagining I can see the dust of Comanche horses in the distance. In those moments, I am Nadua again, strong, free, and loved. But then reality crashes back, and I am once more Cynthia Ann Parker, a lost soul adrift in a world I no longer understand. If there's one thing I've learned from my long and turbulent life, it's that home isn't a place. It's the people you love. My home was with the Comanche, and a part of me will always be there with them, galloping across the endless prairies under an endless sky. I share this story not for pity or judgment, but in the hope that others might understand the complexity of cultural identity and the deep scars left by forced assimilation. My tale is just one of many, a testament to the resilience of the human spirit and the enduring power of love and family, no matter what form they may take. As I near the end of my life, I find myself longing more than ever for the simple beauty of my years with the Comanche, the feel of the wind in my hair as I rode across the plains, the taste of fresh buffalo meat roasted over an open fire, the sound of drums and singing around the evening campfire. These are the memories that sustain me now, that bring a spark of joy to my weary heart. In my dreams, I am young again, running free with my Comanche family. And perhaps, when I close my eyes for the final time, that is where I will remain, forever wild, forever free, forever Nadua.